Chapter 1. Whispers of the Past. Ulthuan, the ruins of Sarthalor. The salt-laden wind cut through the ruins like a dagger, sweeping through shattered archways and worn elven statues, their once pristine marble features weathered by time and war. High above the white cliffs of Ulthuan, the ruins of Sarthalor, an ancient city lost during the Sundering, stood in silent mourning for an age long past. Kaelith Sunshadow stepped carefully over a pile of rubble, his fine boots crunching against ancient fragments of white stone. The air was thick with dust, disturbed only by his movements and those of his retinue. Behind him Aelric Starborn, a seasoned warrior with a face etched by battles long won and lost, kept his hand near the hilt of his blade. "This place was abandoned for a reason," Aelric muttered, eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of movement. "Ghosts walk here, Kaelith." "Ghosts do not concern me," Kaelith replied, brushing away the dust from an ornately carved pillar. "The knowledge buried within these stones does." Beneath a collapsed portion of the tower, half buried beneath debris and centuries of neglect, lay a hidden chamber. Its entrance had been sealed with arcane runes, their glow long since faded. Kaelith traced his fingers along the intricate carvings, whispering words in Elthuan, the ancient tongue of the Asur. As the final syllable left his lips, the seal shimmered, then shattered like brittle glass. The entrance groaned open. The air that rushed out was stale and heavy, carrying the scent of decay and secrets best left forgotten. Inside, the chamber was lined with tattered banners of House Caladrius, a noble family thought lost during the Sundering. Bookshelves, their wooden frames blackened with age, held decayed scrolls and tomes. Kaelith moved with reverence, brushing away dust from a pedestal in the center of the room. Upon it lay a sealed scroll, wrapped in violet silk and inscribed with glyphs of warding. His heartbeat quickened. He knew, even before unwrapping it, that he had found something of immense importance. Kaelith carefully unwound the fabric, revealing delicate parchment covered in impossibly fine script. His eyes widened as he read. "Vaul's echo, the fragment of the rift hidden beyond the mists of Yvresse, the key to what was lost." Kaelith exhaled sharply. This was it. A relic of power from the days of the Sundering, one that had been thought lost forever. Before he could speak, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber, a scream. Aelric's sword was already drawn as the shadows at the edge of the room coalesced into something far worse than ghosts. The Druchii? Dark cloaked figures emerged from the shadows, their blackened armor melding with the gloom. The first blade came for Kaelith's throat, only for Aelric to intercept it with a savage riposte, steel clashing against steel in a bright arc. Kaelith stumbled back, the scroll clutched in his grip as battle erupted around him. Aelric cut down one assassin with a brutal slash, but another took his place instantly. Blood sprayed across the stone as one of Kaelith's guards was gutted, the Druchii's wickedly curved dagger twisting as he tore the life from his victim. Kaelith barely dodged a blade meant for his spine. The Druchii assassin hissed a curse in their cruel tongue and lunged again, only to be stopped mid-motion as Aelric drove his sword through the raider's chest. For a heartbeat the Druchii stared at him, mouth opening in surprise. Then Aelric twisted the blade and ripped it free, sending the corpse tumbling lifelessly to the ground. "We have what we came for," Aelric bellowed, gripping Kaelith's arm. "We need to leave." Kaelith knew he was right. This wasn't a battle they could win. They had been followed, perhaps betrayed. And if the Druchii were already here, then the race for Vaul's echo had already begun. They ran, leaving the dead behind, their blood soaking into the stones of Sarthalor like an offering to the past. Naggaroth, the black spire of Caron-Kar. Far from the sunlit towers of Ulthuan, the city of Caron-Kar stood like a serrated wound against the bleak landscape of Naggaroth. The air was thick with the scent of the flesh pits, where monsters were bred, and tortured screams echoed endlessly. Within the black spire, where shadows seemed to slither along the walls, Selithra Duskbane stood before a scrying pool, her fingers tracing the cold rim of its obsidian surface. She had seen the battle unfold in Sarthalar, watched as the Asur had fled with their prize. They had stolen what should have been hers. The artifact had been hidden for centuries, lost in the war that had torn their kind apart, but now it called to her, whispering, seething, yearning to be claimed by a true master. And she would not allow the weaklings of Ulthuan to take it from her. A flick of her wrist sent the vision scattering like ink dissolving in water. She turned to the figure waiting behind her, Dreadlord Malachar Blackthorn, his armored form exuding menace, his eyes as cold as the seas beyond Naggaroth. "The Asur have the scroll," she said, her voice sharp as a dagger's edge. Malachar tilted his head slightly. "Then we take it from them." Selithra smiled darkly. "No. Let them carry it to where it must go. Let them do the work of finding Vaul's echo for us." She stepped closer, her lips curling. "Then, when they have unearthed it, we take it." Malachar let out a low chuckle. "A cruel game. The only kind worth playing," she whispered. She turned back to the scrying pool, the image of Kaelith and his warriors fleeing into the mists of Ulthuan still burning in her mind. Let the Asur run. Let them believe they were safe. Because soon the hunt would begin. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Deep. Naggaroth. The dread hold of Karondkar. The air in Karankara was thick with the scent of blood and damp iron. The vast city, carved from black stone and draped in the banners of 1,000 raiding houses, loomed over the jagged coastline like a beast waiting to strike. Chains rattled in the distance, accompanied by the muffled screams of prisoners being prepared for the flesh markets. At the heart of the city, atop a spiraling tower wreathed in violet flames, Selithra Duskbane stood before her warband. The assembled warriors were a vision of cruelty and precision. Black-armored corsairs, their sea dragon cloaks fluttering in the icy wind, gripped their serrated cutlasses. Cold One knights, their monstrous mounts snorting puffs of steaming breath, waited in disciplined silence. Shades, the assassins of the northern wastes, melted into the shadows at the edges of the courtyard, their crimson eyes glinting in the torchlight. Selithra herself was dressed for war. Her blackened armor, adorned with intricate runes, reflected the firelight in eerie flashes. A blade forged in the dark forges of Grond hung at her hip, a wicked, curved weapon that had ended countless lives. Her long silver hair cascaded over her shoulders, a stark contrast to the malevolent gleam in her eyes. At her side stood Dreadlord Malachar Blackthorn, his expression unreadable beneath his horned helm. He regarded her with quiet scrutiny before speaking. "You understand what is at stake," he said, his voice as cold as the Naggarothian winds. "Vaul's echo is no mere trinket. It is a relic of the Sundering itself, a weapon that could change the course of our war. And yet—" He paused, stepping closer. "I do not trust you to claim it alone." Selithra's lips curled. She knew better than to challenge Malachar openly. He was one of the Witch King's favored commanders, and despite his politeness, there was no doubt he would kill her if she failed him. "Then send your spies to watch me, my lord," she said smoothly. "Let them whisper their doubts while I bring you the relic. Let them crawl behind me while I take what is rightfully ours." A cruel smile ghosted across Malachar's lips. "If you fail, there will be no mercy, Selithra. There never is." He nodded, satisfied. Then, with a flick of his hand, he gestured toward the distant harbor. "Your ship is ready. Do not disappoint me." Selithra turned without another word, striding down the marble steps to where her warband awaited. As she moved, her eyes flickered toward the massive war galley moored in the harbor below. It was the Voidfang, one of the fastest and deadliest vessels in the Druchii fleet, its hull reinforced with black iron and adorned with the bones of those who had fallen before it. The sails were stitched from flayed skin, dyed deep crimson. Tonight they would set sail. Tonight the hunt for Vaul's echo would begin. The dungeons of Karankar. Before departure, there was one last task. Selithra descended into the depths of the dread hold, past cells where prisoners lay broken in chains, past chambers where tormented screams echoed against the cold stone walls. She was not here for mere slaves. She had a sacrifice to make. At the lowest level of the prison, she entered a dimly lit chamber where a single captive hung from iron shackles. He was an Asur, his once fine robes tattered, his golden hair matted with dried blood. His back was a latticework of wounds where the torturers had cut him for information. Selithra stepped forward, tilting his chin up with the tip of her dagger. "Still alive, little flame," she purred. The elf's eyes, though bloodshot, still burned with defiance. He spat at her feet, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "You will never find it." Selithra smiled, her amusement genuine. "I already have," she whispered. "And now, I only need a key to unlock its secrets." She raised her dagger and with a slow, deliberate motion, traced its edge along his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. "The Asur believe in purity," she continued, circling him like a predator. "That is why you fall so easily. Purity shatters under pain." Without hesitation, she plunged the dagger into his stomach, twisting it cruelly. The elf arched in agony, his cry sharp and raw. Blood dripped onto the floor in heavy splashes, pooling at her feet. The scent of it, hot and coppery, filled the air. Selithra leaned in, her lips inches from his ear. "Sing for me, Asur," she whispered. The elf gasped, his breath ragged. "You are nothing but a shadow of what we once were." He managed. Selithra's expression darkened. She ripped the dagger free, letting his blood spill freely onto the stone. "Then let the shadows take you," she said coldly. With a single, fluid motion, she slit his throat. The elf slumped, his life pouring from him in warm rivulets. Selithra watched as the light faded from his eyes, feeling nothing but satisfaction. His death was meaningless, just another body to be discarded. But the ritual was complete. The sacrifice had been made. As the Asur's blood seeped into the ritual markings carved into the floor, the room trembled slightly, the air shimmering with dark energy. A voice, ancient and whispering, echoed in her mind. "The path is open, the way is clear. Seek the vault of Yvresse, seek Vaul's echo." Selithra closed her eyes and smiled. It had begun. The Voidfang, setting sail. Night had fallen by the time Selithra boarded the Voidfang. The ship rocked gently against the dock as her warriors took their positions. The slaves below deck moaned in exhaustion, chained together in the darkness, awaiting whatever cruel fate the Druchii had planned for them. The wind carried the scent of the Black Sea, and the waters, dark and endless, reflected the violet glow of Naggaroth's burning skyline. Selithra stood at the prow of the ship, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Kaelith Sunshadow had the scroll. He would think he was safe within the borders of Ulthuan. He was wrong. She would find him. She would take the artifact. And when the time came, she would carve the truth of the Sundering into his flesh, so that he would know in his final moments that he had never stood a chance. With a wave of her hand, the sails unfurled, catching the cold wind. The Voidfang surged forward into the night, carrying death and darkness toward the shores of Ulthuan. Chapter 3. The Council's Doubt. Lothern. The Phoenix Court. The great city of Lothern, the jewel of Ulthuan, gleamed beneath the light of Asur's sun. Its spires, crafted from white marble and adorned with gold, stretched toward the heavens, while vast avenues teemed with scholars, merchants, and warriors of the Asur. Beyond its glittering walls, the sea gates of Ulthuan, guarded by statues of ancient kings, stood defiant against the encroaching waves. But despite its splendor, Kaelith Sunshadow felt no comfort as he ascended the steps of the Phoenix Court. His boots echoed against the polished floor of the Grand Hall, where the Council of the Phoenix King convened. Towering columns flanked the chamber, their surfaces etched with the histories of Ulthuan's greatest victories. At the far end of the room, beneath an arched window overlooking the endless sea, sat the assembled advisors of the Phoenix Court, their robes glimmering in the golden light. At the center of them was Prince Caladrian of Sathari, his silvered hair draped over his shoulders, his face as unreadable as the ocean's depths. Around him, other lords of Ulthuan observed Kaelith with wary gazes, some impassive, others openly skeptical. Kaelith dropped to one knee, his voice steady but urgent. "My lords, I bring grave news. In the ruins of Sark Teola, I have uncovered proof of a relic lost since the Sundering, Vaul's echo." A murmur rippled through the chamber. A few counselors exchanged glances, while others scoffed quietly. Caladrian's eyes flickered with momentary interest, but his tone remained measured. "The Sundering has left many ghosts, Kaelith. What makes you so certain this artifact still exists?" Kaelith stood, his fingers tightening into fists. "The scroll I retrieved spoke of a fragment, one tied to the very rift that split our lands apart. It was hidden in Yvresse beneath the mists, long forgotten. This is no mere trinket. It is a weapon, a remnant of power that—" "You claim much," interrupted Lord Thalior of Lothern, a veteran general whose skepticism was written in the deep lines of his face. "Yet bring nothing to prove it. A fragment of the rift? A lost relic of Vaul? You sound like a child chasing fairy tales." Kaelith's patience strained. "My lord, the Druchii have already moved to claim it. If we hesitate, they will." "And where is your proof of this?" "The attack in Sir Tyler, the Druchii assassins who ambushed us." "A band of raiders, no doubt," another counselor muttered. "They strike at our ruins like carrion birds, proves nothing." Frustration burned in Kaelith's chest. He turned back to Caladrian, his voice filled with urgency. "My prince, if we allow this relic to fall into the hands of the Witch King, we may bring about another cataclysm. You must—" "Enough," Caladrian said softly but with authority. The chamber fell silent. He studied Kaelith for a long moment, then exhaled. "I do not doubt your sincerity, but the burden of proof lies with you. We will not dispatch an army to chase shadows. If you truly believe this relic exists, you will find it on your own." Kaelith's heart sank. "You would have me act alone?" "You would be far from alone," Caladrian said. "Take your warriors. If your fears prove true, then return with evidence, and the council will act." Kaelith clenched his jaw. He had hoped the court would see reason, would rally the strength of Ulthuan to stand against this looming threat. Instead, they had turned their backs. Bowing stiffly, he turned on his heel and strode from the chamber, his frustration barely concealed. If the council would not listen, then he would act without them. The warrior's oath, the armory of Lothern. The clang of steel rang through the courtyard as warriors practiced their forms, their blades flashing beneath the midday sun. In a shadowed alcove, Captain Aelric Starborn adjusted the straps of his armor, watching as Kaelith approached. "I take it they refuse you," Aelric said, sheathing his sword. Kaelith exhaled sharply. "They believe me, but they will not act without proof." Kaelith snorted. "Typical. They sit in their halls while we bleed to keep Ulthuan safe." He clapped a hand on Kaelith's shoulder. "I suppose you'll be needing some stubborn fools willing to follow you into danger." Kaelith allowed himself a smirk. "It would help." "Then you're in luck," Aelric said, nodding toward a group of warriors nearby. "There are always those among us who do not fear death or duty." Gathered before them stood 20 warriors, a mix of seasoned swordsmen, agile archers, and spellcasters whose magic could turn the tide of battle. They were not an army, but they were loyal. Kaelith met their gazes, his voice ringing with conviction. The council will not act, but we will. The Druchii already hunt this relic, and if they take it, they will unleash a power we cannot stop. We leave for Yvresse before dawn. If you march with me, know this: we may not return. A silence hung in the air. Then, one by one, the warriors stepped forward, saluting in the Esker fashion, a hand over the heart, a silent vow of loyalty. Aelaric smirked. Then it seems we have our warband. Kaelith nodded. The hunt for Vaul's echo had begun. Beyond the walls of Lothern, into the unknown. That night, under the silver light of the twin moons, Kaelith and his company rode out from Lothern, their cloaks billowing behind them as they left the safety of the city's walls. The air was thick with tension. They were no longer under the protection of the Phoenix Court. They were alone. And in the shadows beyond Ulthuan's coast, the Void Fang sailed ever closer, its black sails carrying death across the waves. Selithra Duskbane was coming, and blood would be spilled before the end. Chapter 4. Dark Designs. The Void Fang, drifting toward war. The Void Fang sliced through the black waves like a specter in the night, its hull silent against the restless sea. No lanterns burned on its decks. No songs of drunken sailors filled the air. This was no ordinary voyage. It was a hunt. Selithra Duskbane stood at the prow, the cold wind whipping at her cloak, her silver hair streaming like a banner of war. Her violet eyes, sharp as a blade's edge, watched the horizon as the jagged silhouette of the silent isle loomed in the distance. Somewhere out there, Kaelith Sunshadow was coming. The Asur would move cautiously, believing themselves safe beneath the shroud of Ulthuan's domain. Fools. Selithra knew better. The Silent Isle had been abandoned long ago, cursed by the ghosts of the Sundering. It was a graveyard of forgotten things, and soon it would be soaked in fresh blood. Behind her, First Mate Vardis Darktide stepped forward, his face marked with old scars, twisted into a grin. "The fleet is ready, mistress," he said. 3 warships shadow us in the fog. We'll have the isle surrounded before dawn." Selithra didn't acknowledge him at first. Her mind was fixed on the game, the endless war between their people, the dance of blood and vengeance that had begun thousands of years ago and would never end. Kaelith had taken the scroll. He had led her to Vaul's echo without even knowing it. All that remained was to take it from him. At last she turned to Vardis. "There will be no mercy," she said, her voice as cold as the sea. "I want him broken before he dies. I want the Asur to know they were never meant to win." Vardis chuckled, his fingers playing along the hilt of his cutlass. "And if he resists?" Selithra's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Then we carve his screams into the rocks of the isle." With that she turned on her heel and strode toward the command deck. "Raise the black sails," she ordered. "We hunt at dawn." The Silent Isle. A cursed graveyard. Across the sea, Kaelith Sunshadow rode at the head of his warband, his boots sinking into the damp sand as they made landfall on the Silent Isle. The wind howled through the ruined structures of the once great elven outpost, its broken towers jutting into the sky like skeletal fingers. The very air was heavy with memory, as if the stones themselves still whispered of the battles that had been fought here. Ancient bones lay scattered beneath their feet, some long picked clean by scavengers, others still entombed in rusted armor, their weapons gripped in skeletal hands. Kaelith exhaled, adjusting his cloak. "This place is cursed," one of his warriors muttered. Elric Starborn, standing beside him, scoffed. "So is the entirety of Naggaroth, but that never stopped us from killing Druchii when the need arose." Kaelith allowed himself a small smirk. True enough. Still, he could not shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows among the ruins seemed to move when he wasn't looking, shifting in the edges of his vision. He turned to his warriors. "We do not linger," he said. "Find whatever remains of the outpost archives. We take what we need and leave before nightfall." Elric nodded. "You heard him." The warriors spread out, picking their way through the ruins. Kaelith stepped forward, his fingers trailing across the weathered stone of an ancient mural, a depiction of elves in battle, their swords locked in a desperate struggle. Asur and Druchii, brothers turned enemies, locked in eternal war. A sudden noise, a scraping of metal, made him turn sharply. Nothing, just the wind. And yet, something wasn't right. Elric returned, holding a fragment of a stone tablet, the runes etched upon it barely readable. "It speaks of a hidden vault beneath the isle," he said. "Something buried deep." Kaelith took the tablet, his mind racing. This could be it, the first true clue to Vaul's echo. But before he could speak, a horn sounded from the sea. His blood turned to ice. Druchii. The Druchii attack, blood in the sand. The void fangs struck like a viper. The moment Kaelith's warriors turned toward the shore, black arrows rained from the mist, each one tipped with wickedly serrated barbs. One of his men let out a strangled cry as a bolt punched through his throat, blood spraying against the ruins as he collapsed. Elric barely had time to raise his shield before another wave of arrows slammed into their ranks, piercing armor, flesh, and bone. The screams of the wounded filled the air. "To arms!" Kaelith roared, drawing his blade as Druchii corsairs surged onto the beach. The first enemy to reach him was a corsair captain. His mouth twisted into a snarl as he lunged, twin blades flashing in the dim light. Kaelith parried one strike, ducked the second, then drove his sword through the Druchii's ribs. The corsair choked, dark blood spilling over his lips as Kaelith ripped the blade free and let him drop. Aelric, fighting beside him, hacked off a raider's arm before slamming his sword through the Druchii's eye socket, twisting the blade savagely before pulling it free. The sands turned black with blood as the battle raged. But this was no simple raid. From the fog, Cold One knights charged forward, their massive reptilian mounts snarling as they plowed through the Asur ranks. Kaelith barely rolled aside as one of the beasts crashed into the ruins, its rider swinging a jagged glaive meant to take his head. He countered with a spell, a burst of white-hot energy from his palm that seared through the knight's armor, sending him tumbling from the saddle in a charred, smoking heap. But there were too many of them. And then, from the mist, Selithra Duskbane stepped onto the battlefield. Her violet robes billowed in the wind, her silver hair catching the light as she raised one pale hand, and the air rippled with dark magic. The very ground trembled as spectral chains of shadow erupted from the earth, ensnaring Kaelith's warriors, dragging them screaming into the void. Kaelith turned, locking eyes with her across the carnage. He saw the cruelty in her gaze, the amusement, the hunger for his pain. And he knew then and there that this was only the beginning. The hunt for Vaul's echo had begun, and blood would drown the sands before it was over. Chapter 5. The Silent Isle. The Isle of the Damned. The Silent Isle was more graveyard than land, its jagged cliffs scarred by the echoes of a war fought thousands of years ago. The sea lapped at its blackened shores, where shattered elven ruins stood like the bones of some long-dead titan. Even the wind did not whisper here. There were no birds, no signs of life, only the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, as if the sea itself mourned what had been lost. Kaelith Sunshadow had heard the legends. The isle had once been an outpost of the Asur, before the Sundering had split their people asunder. It was said that the ghosts of the fallen still roamed the ruins, trapped in the moment of their slaughter, their souls bound to a war that would never end. But Kaelith was not a man who feared ghosts. The wind pulled at his cloak as he strode forward. Aelric Starborn at his side. Their warriors moved cautiously through the ruins, their weapons drawn. "We should not be here," one of his men muttered. "The dead do not sleep on this isle." Aelric scoffed. "Let them wake then. I've always wanted to cut a ghost in half." Kaelith smirked, but said nothing. He was too focused on what lay ahead. Somewhere beneath these ruins, the key to Vaul's echo awaited. The only question was whether they would live long enough to claim it. The Druchii approach. Beyond the mist-shrouded cliffs, Selithra Duskbane stood at the prow of the Voidfang, her violet robes billowing in the cold wind. The silent isle was close now, close enough that she could smell the death in the air, the lingering scent of old, dried blood that no tide could wash away. She smiled. This place felt right. Light home. Behind her, Varthus Darktide, her first mate, scanned the shore with a spyglass. "They're here," he murmured. "The Asur." Selithra exhaled in amusement. Of course they were. Kaelith Sunshadow was proving most useful, leading her straight to the artifact like a trained beast. She turned, addressing her gathered warriors. "Corsairs, Shades, and Cold One Knights, all eager for blood. The Asur believe they can claim what is ours," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Let them believe, let them search, and then, when the time is right." She let the words linger, her meaning clear. The Voidfang dropped anchor, and the hunt began. The ruins, first blood. Kaelith's company moved carefully through the abandoned structures. The once grand towers collapsed, their walls etched with ancient battle scars. Here and there skeletal remains lay tangled in rusted armor, their bones frozen in the grim embrace of a battle never finished. Kaelith stopped before a weathered archway, the entrance to what had once been a temple. Its doors had long since been ripped from their hinges, the sacred symbols defaced. Something shifted in the shadows. Kaelith's hand went to his sword. Then came the whisper, a sound that was not the wind. Aelric stiffened. What was that? Kaelith narrowed his eyes. Then he saw it. Movement in the mist. Figures stalking through the ruins, barely visible. Shadows that did not belong. Druchii. The realization came a heartbeat too late. The first arrow struck an Asur warrior in the throat. The elf gagged, clawing at the black-fletched shaft protruding from his neck before collapsing in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. Then came the second volley. Bolts rained from the shadows, cutting through Kaelith's men with merciless precision. One warrior staggered backward, 3 arrows buried in his chest before he toppled like a felled tree. Another screamed as a bolt punched through his eye, sending him convulsing to the ground. "Ambush!" Aelric roared, raising his shield. The Shades emerged from the ruins like phantoms. Druchii assassins, their blades gleaming, their crimson eyes burning with malice. Kaelith drew his sword just in time to meet the first attacker. The Shade came at him fast, twin daggers flashing. Kaelith parried the first strike, ducked the second, then drove his knee into the assassin's ribs, sending him sprawling. Before the Druchii could recover, Kaelith's sword slashed through his throat, severing flesh and cartilage. Another Shade lunged at Aelric, who caught the assassin's wrist mid-strike and with a vicious twist snapped the bone. The Druchii barely had time to scream before Aelric's sword punched through his gut, spilling his entrails onto the ground. The ruins erupted into chaos as Asur and Druchii clashed in brutal, close-quarters combat. A warrior beside Kaelith let out a guttural cry as a Druchii blade punched through his back, emerging blood-slicked from his chest. His killer, a corsair, sneered as he ripped the sword free, only to be headed a moment later by one of Kaelith's men. The sands ran black with Asur and Druchii blood alike. Kaelith turned, just in time to see her. Selithra. She stepped from the mist like a specter, her violet eyes locked onto his, her lips curved into an amused smirk. Then she raised her hand. Kaelith barely had time to react before shadow tendrils erupted from the ground, coiling around his warriors, dragging them screaming into the darkness. He slashed at the magic, but it was like fighting smoke. Elric snarled, stepping between Kaelith and Selithra. "Cowards fight with tricks," he spat. Selithra tilted her head. "Then let us see if steel fares any better." With a flick of her wrist, her blade was in her hand, and the duel began. Elric struck first, his sword a blur of silver, but Selithra was faster. She sidestepped the blow, bringing her dagger up in a lightning-fast riposte, aiming for his ribs. Elric barely dodged, but not fast enough. The dagger sliced across his side, blood spurting from the wound. He stumbled, gritting his teeth, but kept fighting. Selithra laughed. "Is this the best Ulthuan has to offer?" she taunted. Elric roared, bringing his sword down in a killing arc, only for Selithra to vanish in a swirl of shadow, reappearing behind him. Before he could react, she buried her dagger into his shoulder, twisting it deep. Elric screamed. Kaelith lunged, his blade flashing, forcing Selithra to retreat before she could finish the kill. Blood dripped from Elric's wound, staining his armor. Selithra exhaled in amusement, licking Elric's blood from her blade. "Next time, I'll take your heart," she whispered. Then, before Kaelith could reach her, she was gone. The remaining Druchii faded into the mist, leaving only the dead and the dying behind. Kaelith clenched his fists. This was no longer just a race. This was war. Chapter 6. Blood on the Sand. The ruins of the Silent Isle, a battlefield of shadows. The air stank of blood and salt, the thick scent of war clinging to the ancient ruins like a curse. Corpses littered the shattered stones. Asur and Druchii alike, their lifeblood soaking into the sand, darkening it with the stain of their endless war. Kaelith Sunshadow's heart hammered against his ribs. His sword dripped red, the blade slick with the still-warm blood of a Druchii shade, its wielder lying lifeless at his feet. All around him the skirmish still raged. Alias Starborn fought nearby, his great sword a whirlwind of death, hacking through the enemy like a reaper in a field of flesh. He cut down a corsair, his blade shearing through the Druchii's collarbone, nearly cleaving him in two. The dying elf spasmed as his entrails spilled onto the ground, steaming in the cold night air. But for every Druchii they struck down, more emerged from the shadows. From the mist, Selithra Duskbane watched, her violet eyes gleaming like polished amethysts. She could feel it now. The pulse of power. The whisper of something old, something that had slept beneath this cursed land for millennia. Vaul's echo. It was here. A slow, delighted smile spread across her lips. "Enough playing," she murmured, lifting one hand. With a flick of her wrist, dark magic surged through the ruins. From the ground, jagged tendrils of shadow erupted, coiling around Kaelith's warriors, dragging them screaming into the abyss. One soldier thrashed, his sword useless against the magic as the shadows wrapped around his throat. His eyes bulged as the tendrils constricted. Then, with a sickening crack, his neck snapped. Another warrior fell to his knees, clutching at his own reflection as the magic turned his own shadow against him. A twisted, living copy that plunged a dagger into his heart. Kaelith gritted his teeth. They had to fall back. "Elrock!" he roared, blocking a corsair's strike before driving his blade through the raider's eye, feeling the sickening resistance of skull and brain. Elric heard him through the carnage. "We're outnumbered. Into the ruins." Kaelith nodded. With the last of their strength, they broke from the melee, cutting a bloody path through the Druchii and sprinting toward the ruined temple at the isle's center. Selithra watched them flee, but she made no move to pursue. She had no need. She could feel the artifact calling to her. And something else, something much older, was watching. The ruined temple, beneath the sands. Kaelith and Elric stumbled into the half-collapsed temple, their boots kicking up thick clouds of dust. Behind them, The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the ancient halls. Kaelith exhaled, pressing a hand to his wounded side, feeling the hot, sticky warmth of blood seeping through his armor. Ylric spat onto the floor, his face twisted with frustration. "Druchii witch," he snarled. "Damn her magic." Kaelith nodded grimly. "She knew about the artifact before we did." Ylric scoffed. "Then let's find it first." The temple was old. The stonework, cracked and worn, was covered in runes from the time of the Sundering, a time when Asur and Druchii fought as kin before turning their blades on one another. But beneath those carvings, there was something older. Kaelith stepped closer, running his fingers along the ancient glyphs. The markings were not Asur. Not even Druchii. "This is wrong," he muttered. "This language predates the Sundering." Ylric frowned. "Meaning?" Kaelith swallowed. "Meaning we are standing on something that should have stayed buried." As if in answer, the ground trembled. Ylric stiffened, gripping his sword. That wasn't the wind. Kaelith's breath quickened. Something beneath them was stirring. Selithra summoning. Outside the ruins, Selithra knelt upon the blackened sand, her fingers tracing an ancient sigil carved into the stone. She could feel the energy beneath the isle, power older than the war between their kind, power that had waited to be awakened. Her lips curled into a smile as she cut her palm, letting her blood drip onto the sigil. The sands shuddered. Then they parted, the thing that should not wake. Kaelith and Ylric barely had time to react as the temple floor collapsed beneath them. They fell, crashing into the darkness below. Pain exploded across Kaelith's back as he hit the ground. Above him, Ylric groaned, struggling to his feet. Then they heard it. The breathing, slow, deep. Kaelith's blood ran cold. Ylric whispered, "What in the name of Asurian?" The shadows moved, and then they saw it. The thing that lay buried beneath the ice. A colossal figure, its flesh fused with the stone, its eyes hollow and filled with a golden, seething light. Its body was not entirely elven, nor entirely mortal. It was twisted, broken, a thing that should not exist. And as its ancient eyes fell upon them, it opened its mouth to scream. The sound was not a sound. It was 1,000 voices shrieking at once, a chorus of pain that shattered the walls of the temple, sending chunks of stone raining down. Kaelith staggered, clutching his head. Visions flooded his mind, of war, of gods abandoned, of something forged in the first fires of creation itself. Vaul's echo. This thing had been its guardian. And now, after thousands of years, it was awake. The isle trembles. Outside, Selithra smiled as the ground convulsed. She could feel the temple crumbling, the power below unleashing itself. This was what she had come for. As the sands cracked, as the ruins began to collapse, she turned to Varthus Darktide. "Send the order," she said softly. Varthus hesitated. "What order?" Selithra's eyes gleamed with amusement. "Kill them all." Chapter 7. Echoes of Vaul. The ruins tremble. The silent isle was no longer silent. The very earth trembled as something older than time itself stirred beneath the ruins. Kaelith Sunshadow staggered to his feet, his head pounding from the impact of his fall. The dust had not yet settled, and already the chamber they had crashed into was alive with movement. He looked around, his vision blurred, but what he saw made his breath hitch. The colossal figure in the center of the chamber was moving. Its once stone flesh cracked and groaned as it slowly unfurled, its glowing golden eyes burning into the darkness. Aelec Starborn, blood trickling from his forehead, pushed himself up beside Kaelith. His hand instinctively reached for his sword. "What?" In Asrian's name. Is that? He whispered, horror plain in his voice. Kaelith did not know. But before he could answer, the thing spoke. Fools, you disturbed the echoes of a war never finished. Its voice was not one but many, layered, distorted, filled with agony. Kaelith's heart pounded. This was no living creature, no mortal guardian. This thing was a relic of the Sundering itself. And it was not alone. The chamber shifted. A howling wail rose from the cracked stone, a sound that rattled bones and sent cold shivers down Kaelith's spine. Then, from the shadows they came, the spirits of the fallen. At first they were only whispers, thin and barely formed, like smoke curling through the air. But then they solidified, taking shape. Elves. Thousands of them. Ghosts of the Sundering, clad in the armor of another age, their bodies warped by time and rage. Some bore the proud helms of the Asur, their spectral hands gripping long shattered spears. Others were Druchii, their armor blackened, their cloaks torn and dripping with the memory of old blood. But there was no distinction between friend and foe. They all turned their hollow burning eyes toward the intruders. Kaelith's breath hitched. "We need to move," he whispered. Alec didn't need to be told twice. The first ghost lunged, its spectral blade slicing through the air like a scream. Kaelith barely dodged, rolling aside as the ancient warrior's weapon passed through stone and burned it black. "These are no mere phantoms," Aelric hissed. "They're still fighting the war." Kaelith parried another strike, though his sword passed harmlessly through the spirit's body. It was like trying to cut a shadow in the mist. Aelric let out a curse as another spectre reached through his chest, not to wound, but to pull at his very soul. He shuddered violently, his face twisting in pain. Kaelith lashed out, his free hand channeling a burst of white-hot energy. The spell struck the spirit in the chest and it screamed, its form unraveling like silk caught in fire. The others turned toward him. The magic hurt them. That was something. But before they could strike again, a new force entered the chamber. From the collapsed ceiling, the Druchii arrived. Selithra's arrival. Selithra Duskbane landed gracefully on the broken stones, her blade already drawn, her lips curled into a smile. She had watched the Asur struggle, watched them stumble in the dark. Now she would take what was rightfully hers. Vartus Darktide and a handful of her best warriors followed, their eyes gleaming in the unnatural light. Then she saw them. The ghosts. Her amusement faded. Varthus, ever the skeptic, sneered. "More elven phantoms. Let them watch, while we—" A spectral warrior descended upon him. Before he could finish his words, the spirit's blade sliced through his chestplate, but not as steel would. It pulled at his essence, draining his life itself. Varthus choked, his body withering, his skin turning ashen. He screamed. A long, agonized, tormented scream. And then he was gone. Selithra exhaled sharply. So, these were not mere spirits. These were something worse. But then she felt it. The pulse beneath the chamber. Something buried deep. Her eyes lit up with hunger. "The artifact is here," she murmured. Kaelith, catching his breath, heard her words. He turned to Aelric. "We cannot let her claim it." Elric's eyes blazed with fury. "Then we finish this. Escape into the unknown." The spirits attacked again. Kaelith parried wildly, but they were relentless. Aelric grabbed him by the shoulder, pointing to a collapsed passageway at the far end of the chamber. "There, a way out." Kaelith hesitated, just long enough to see Selithra raise her hands. Dark magic surged from her fingers, colliding with the spirits. But they did not die. They turned on her. The Druchii screamed as their own magic betrayed them, as the shadows they wielded turned against them. Selidra's eyes widened in rare panic as she stumbled backward. Kaelith made his choice. He grabbed the closest ancient tablet, the one half buried in the rubble, and ran. Selithra saw him fleeing. She let out a furious shriek. "Stop them!" But it was too late. Kaelith and Aelric plunged into the darkness of the ruined passage, stones crumbling behind them. And as they ran, Kaelith looked down at the tablet in his hands. The inscription was barely legible, but the message was clear. "The vault is not here. Seek the mist. Seek the hidden path in Yvresse." Kaelith's heart pounded. They had what they needed. But now Selithra knew too. The race for Vaul's echo was truly beginning, and blood would drown the lands before it was over. Chapter 8. The Price of Power. The flight from the Silent Isle, a desperate escape. The Silent Isle crumbled behind them. Kaelith Sunshadow could still hear the unearthly screams of the dead, their wails chasing him through the collapsing tunnels. Stones tumbled from the ceiling, crashing into the darkness behind them, but he didn't stop. Neither did Aelric Starborn. Side by side they ran, the ancient tablet clutched tightly in Kaelith's hand. Every breath burned in his chest, but still he ran, because to stop now was to die. Selithra's fury had been unmistakable. The Druchii wanted the artifact just as much as he did, and they had no mercy in their souls. The passage opened up suddenly, revealing the moonlit ruins beyond. In the distance, their ship waited, its sails unfurled, the ocean beckoning them away from this cursed place. Kaelith didn't hesitate. "Get to the ship," he shouted. Aelric didn't need to be told twice. He let out a sharp warrior's cry, signaling the remaining Asur warriors. Behind them, the shadows twisted. Selithra's dark magic pulsed through the ruins. Spears of pure shadow erupted from the ground, impaling one of Kaelith's men, lifting him into the air before tearing him apart in a shower of gore. Another warrior let out a choked gasp as spectral hands wrapped around his throat, crushing the life from him before dragging his lifeless body into the mist. Kaelith didn't look back. He could hear Selithra's voice, filled with venom and amusement. "Run, little prince. Run while you still can." With a final desperate sprint, Kaelith and Aelric reached the edge of the shore. The small rowboats waited for them. "Go!" Aelric bellowed. They hurled themselves into the boats, shoving off from the shore just as Druchii arrows rained down. One warrior screamed as a barbed bolt punched through his chest, his body convulsing before slipping into the sea. But they were too late to stop them now. The boats rowed out toward the main ship, the Windrider, a sleek elven vessel built for speed and precision. Kaelith looked back one last time. Selithra stood upon the cliffs, the wind howling around her violet eyes burning with hatred and hunger. The war had truly begun. Aboard the Windrider, the secrets of Vaul's echo. The Windrider cut through the sea, its sails catching the wind as they put distance between themselves and the cursed isle. Kaelith, still catching his breath, handed the ancient tablet to the ship's mages, 3 scholars trained in the arcane arts of Hoeth, their robes shimmering with woven enchantments. The eldest among them, Ithelian Starcaller, examined the tablet with a frown of deep concern. "This is not what I expected," he murmured. Kaelith narrowed his eyes. "Explain." Ithelian traced his fingers over the worn glyphs. "This tablet predates even the Sundering. It speaks of a power so unstable, so dangerous, that it was sealed away in the vault of Yvresse, not to protect it, but to keep it from consuming everything." Kaelith stiffened. "Consuming?" "The artifact is not a weapon, Lord Sunshadow," Ithelian said gravely. "It is a fragment of something greater, a shard of the rift itself, from when Ulthuan and Naggaroth were torn apart." A silence settled over them. Aelric exhaled sharply. "So, what you're telling us is that we're hunting something that could unmake reality itself." Ithelian gave a slow nod. Kaelith clenched his jaw. The weight of their quest had suddenly grown far heavier. If Vaul's echo fell into the hands of the Druchii, the results would be catastrophic. Selithra could not be allowed to reach Yvresse first, a traitor in their midst. But while the Windriders sailed onward, something far darker was at play below decks. In the shadows of the cargo hold, a lone figure moved silently, navigating between crates of supplies and barrels of rations. Syrian Dawnbreaker, one of Kaelith's warriors, moved with purpose, but his eyes were not filled with loyalty. They were filled with treachery. For Syrian was not truly an Asur. He was a traitor, his soul bought and broken by the Druchii long ago. And now he had a task to complete. His fingers brushed the hilt of a hidden dagger, coated in a venom so potent it could kill even an elf in seconds. His target? Ithilien Starcaller. The mages knew too much. If the Asur deciphered the full truth of the artifact, they would move too swiftly for Selithra's forces to intercept them. That could not be allowed. The ship had to be sabotaged. Syrian moved closer. The mages were gathered near the navigation chamber, their attention still fixed on the tablet. He stepped forward, his hand tightening around the dagger. And then, before he could strike, a voice cut through the air like a blade. Treachery. Syrian barely had time to react before he felt a dagger punch into his side, just beneath his ribs. A twist, sharp, brutal. Pain exploded through him. He gasped, stumbling forward, his dagger falling from his grasp. Blood bubbled from his lips. He turned, his vision swimming, and saw Alric standing over him, his own blade still buried deep in Syrian's gut. Aelric's eyes were ice-cold. "You Druchii filth," Aelert spat. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Syrian tried to speak, but only blood came out. Aelric yanked his dagger free in one brutal motion, and Syrian collapsed, his lifeblood pooling onto the wooden deck. Kaelith stepped forward, watching as the traitor twitched. He knelt, gripping Syrian by the throat. "You were working for Selithra," he said darkly. Tyrion laughed weakly, blood dripping from his lips. "You can't stop her," he rasped. "She knows. What you seek, she will take it from you." Kaelith's fingers tightened. Syrian gurgled, his last breath leaving him as Kaelith crushed his throat with a final merciless squeeze. Aelric exhaled, wiping his blade. One less problem. Kaelith stood, his mind racing. They were compromised. Selithra knew. And that meant the hunt for Vaul's echo was no longer a race. It was a war. Kaelith turned to his mages. "We sail for Yvresse now." The ship lurched forward, its sails billowing in the wind. The final battle for the artifact was about to begin, and only one side would survive. Chapter 9. Betrayal in the Night. A ship in peril. The Windrider rocked violently in the dark waters, its sails billowing against the moonlit sky. The air was thick with salt and the lingering stench of blood. Below decks, Syrian Dawnbreaker's corpse lay twisted in death, his lifeblood still seeping into the floorboards. Kaelith Sunshadow wiped the last remnants of Syrian's treachery from his fingers, but he felt no satisfaction. Aelric Starborn stood beside him, his expression grim. "I don't like this," Aelric muttered, watching as the crew dragged Syrian's body toward the sea. "He had time to sabotage something before we caught him." Kaelith exhaled sharply. "Then we search the ship now." He turned to Ithilien Starcaller, the eldest of their mages. "Syrian was working for Selithra. If she sent him, it means she knows exactly where we are. We don't have time to waste." The mage nodded. "Then let us hope the damage is not beyond repair." Sabotage in the dark. The search began immediately. Kaelith's warriors moved through the ship, checking the rigging, the hull, the rudder. At first, nothing seemed amiss, but as Kaelith descended into the lower decks, a foul stench reached his nose. Something was burning. Elric cursed, drawing his sword. They rushed deeper, pushing past the supply crates and barrels of provisions. The air grew thick and acrid, a choking veil of burning tar and oil. And then they saw it. A hidden explosive charge, buried beneath a pile of supplies. The black powder had already been lit, and the flames were creeping closer to the fuse. Kaelith's heart pounded. "Put it out!" he roared. One of the mages hurled a spell, a surge of ice washing over the burning fuse, snuffing it just in time. But the damage was already done. The fire had spread to the wooden beams, and the hull was weakening from within. "Water, now!" His warriors hurled buckets of seawater onto the spreading fire, desperately trying to contain the destruction Syrian had left behind. A deafening groan ran through the ship as one of the hull's main support beams cracked. Kaelith felt the entire deck shift beneath his feet. If they didn't stop the fire now, the Windrider would break apart at sea, fighting against time. Kaelith grabbed a discarded cloak, using it to smother the flames as more warriors arrived with water. The smoke stung his lungs, burning his throat, but he pressed on, stomping out what embers remained. Elric was beside him, hacking at the burned sections of wood, trying to clear away the weakest parts before they collapsed completely. His muscles strained with effort, sweat mixing with soot on his skin. A final, desperate surge of water doused the last of the flames. A tense silence followed, interrupted only by the creaking of scorched timber. Kaelith wiped the sweat from his brow, surveying the damage. The ship was still seaworthy, but barely. One more attack like that, and they would be left to drown. Elric exhaled sharply. Syrian was thorough. Bastard wanted us at the bottom of the ocean. Kaelith clenched his jaw. Selithra had planned this perfectly. The Druchii were not just brutal, they were cunning, and now Kaelith and his warriors were barely limping forward. He turned to the crew. How long to repair? A grim-faced elf, Eldrin Seaheart, their best shipwright, ran a hand over the weakened beams. All hands working, we can reinforce the hull and keep her sailing, but... He hesitated. We'll be slower. The Druchii fleet already had a lead, now they have an even bigger one. Kaelith felt rage burn in his veins. Selithra was already ahead of them. She was closing in on Vaul's echo. A race against death. As the first light of dawn touched the ocean's horizon, the Windrider limped forward, its sails patched, its hull held together by the sheer determination of its crew. The mages had done what they could, but the ship's speed was crippled. Kaelith stood at the bow, his hands clenched into fists as he stared at the distant horizon. Then he saw it. In the far distance, black sails cut through the mist. The Voidfang was already ahead of them, its sleek, cruel silhouette racing toward Yvresse. Kaelith's heart pounded with fury. Selithra was winning. If she reached the vault of Yvresse first, she would claim the artifact. And if she did, it would mean the end of Ulthuan. Kaelith turned to his crew, his voice steely with resolve. "We will not let the Druchii take this." He looked at Elric, his most trusted friend. "No matter the cost." Elric nodded, his eyes dark with understanding. Then, without hesitation, he called out, "Full sail, we hunt the Voidal Fang." The Windrider groaned, its damaged frame pushing forward, its crew gritting their teeth against the pain. The final chase had begun, and only one ship would survive to reach Vaul's echo. Chapter 10. The Hunt Begins. The Voidfang, cutting through the mist. The Voidfang was a shadow upon the waves, slicing through the sea like a spear driven by fate. The blackened sails billowed in the icy wind, the sigil of the Druchii emblazoned upon them, a cruel mark of conquest. Selithra Duskbane stood at the prow, her silver hair whipping around her as she gazed toward the mist-shrouded waters ahead. Somewhere, beyond the veil of fog, lay Yvresse and Vaul's echo. The thought sent a thrill through her veins. The Asur had been fools to abandon the artifact. Their ancestors had feared it, had sought to bury it beneath magic and stone. But Selithra knew better. Power was meant to be taken. Behind her, Varthus Darktide, her most trusted corsair captain, approached. His face was worn with years of war, his dark armor etched with the scars of 1,000 battles. "The Asur ship is still following us," he growled. "They survived the sabotage." Selithra's eyes narrowed. Kaelith. He was tenacious, she would grant him that. But it wouldn't matter. "We are faster," she said simply. "We reach Yvresse first, and it will not matter if they crawl after us." Varthus hesitated. "The waters ahead. They are cursed. Even the corsairs avoid them." Selithra's smile was razor-sharp. "Then let the sea claim the weak." She turned back to the waves, her eyes gleaming with hunger. "The hunt has begun." The Wind Rider, chasing the darkness. The Wind Rider surged forward, its battered hull groaning beneath the strain. The repairs had held, but barely. Kaelith stood at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Ahead, the Voidfang was little more than a dark silhouette in the distance, but they were gaining. Aelric Starborn stepped beside him, his face etched with frustration. "Chains pushing into the mist-shrouded waters," Aelric muttered. "No saint ship enters those waters." Kaelith knew why. The mist surrounding Yvresse was not natural. It was woven with ancient magic, a last remnant of the warding spells that had once protected the High Elf Kingdom from invaders. But over the centuries, the wards had warped, turning the waters into a death trap. Some ships entered. None returned. Kaelith exhaled sharply. "We follow." Aelric frowned. "You are certain?" Kaelith met his friend's gaze. "If we hesitate, she wins. If we turn back, we forfeit everything." Aelric sighed, then gave a wolfish grin. "Then let's drown the bastards before they reach shore." He turned, shouting orders. "Already the Bostus. If we get close enough, I want the Voidfang pierced through its black heart." The crew scrambled to obey, hurrying to the weapons decks, where massive elven ballistas were prepared for battle. And then, a cry from the crow's nest. "Sails! To the east!" Kaelith's heart sank. Aelric spun, raising his spyglass, his face darkened. Corsairs. The corsair ambush. From the mist they emerged, a rogue fleet of 3 Druchii war galleys, their sails tattered, their hulls scarred from decades of plunder. Corsairs, mercenaries, slavers, killers. Not bound to Malekith's rule, not part of Selithra's forces. They served only gold and the promise of slaughter. And they had seen the chase. They wanted the prize for themselves. A war horn sounded across the sea, deep and ominous. Then, the first volley of hooks and chains launched from their decks, arcing toward the Wind Rider like the claws of some great beast. Kaelith barely had time to react. "Brace!" he roared. The first chain slammed onto the deck, its hooks burying into the wood. Aelric cursed. "They mean to board us." Then, the corsairs came. They swung from the chains, landing on the deck with the grace of assassins, their curved blades flashing in the dim light. The first Asur warrior died instantly, his throat slit before he could even raise his weapon. Another was hauled backwards, screaming, as a corsair's barbed whip wrapped around his ankle, dragging him overboard into the depths below. Kaelith drew his sword, the world around him erupting into chaos. A corsair lunged at him, dagger poised for the kill. Kaelith sidestepped, bringing his sword upward in a brutal arc, splitting the Druchii's gut open. Intestines spilled onto the deck, steaming in the cold air. The corsair choked, stumbling back, before Kaelith finished him with a clean decapitation. Aelric was a force of nature, cleaving through the corsairs with savage efficiency. His blade hacked through a Druchii's ribcage, leaving a gaping wound where his heart had been. Another corsair leapt onto him from behind, only for Aelric to slam his elbow backward, catching the assassin in the face and crushing his nose into a mess of blood and cartilage. The corsair stumbled, and Elric drove his sword through the raider's open mouth, the tip bursting from the back of his skull. He yanked the blade free, panting. "Get these bastards off my ship!" The Asur fought with desperation, their blades clashing against the corsairs in a maelstrom of steel and blood. Bodies fell into the sea, their blood turning the water red. But then another war horn sounded, and the corsairs hesitated. Elric wiped blood from his cheek. What now? Kaelith followed their gaze, toward the Voidfang. Selithra's ship had emerged from the mist, her black sails unfurling fully. She was there, and she had seen the battle unfolding. Kaelith's mind raced. The corsairs wanted the artifact for themselves. But Selithra was no fool. She would not let a pack of mercenaries claim her prize. And so, as the Voidfang loomed closer, the corsairs made their choice. They turned on the Windrider once more. No survivors, kill them all. The battle was not over. It was only just beginning. Chapter 11. The Hidden Path. The shores of Yvresse, a land forgotten. The mist of Yvresse clung to the land like a shroud, rolling across the ruined coast in thick, ghostly tendrils. Towering cliffs loomed over the ashen sands, their once pristine edges now crumbling, devoured by time and war. Kaelith Sunshadow stood at the edge of the shore, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The sea wind carried the scent of salt and decay, the air thick with the whispers of the past. The ruins of Tor Yvresse, once a grand citadel of the Asur, now stood in sullen silence, its spires broken, its walls etched with the scars of 1,000 battles. Aelric Starborn dismounted from his warhorse, his gauntleted hand gripping the reins tightly as he scanned the landscape. "Charming," he muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I always imagined Yvresse would be more alive." Kaelith exhaled, adjusting the scroll case at his side, the one containing the cryptic writings of Nalith Starseer, the ancient mage whose knowledge had led them here. "It was never alive," Kaelith murmured, stepping forward. "The magic here was always different, twisted, even before the Sundering." Aelric snorted. "Wonderful, and we're walking straight into it." Kaelith ignored him, pulling the ancient scroll free. The words of Nalith Starseer. The parchment was old, its edges frayed, but the inscriptions remained clear, etched in silver ink that shimmered beneath the dim light. "Where the stars weep, the path is drawn. Where the sea drowns in mist, the way is shown. Beneath the vault of broken time, the echo waits." Kaelith traced the words with his fingers. "It's a riddle," he murmured. Aelric leaned in, frowning. "A mage's way of saying, walk into a death trap and hope you don't die." Kaelith smirked, rolling the scroll back up. "Come then, let's die wisely." Aelric chuckled darkly. "Lead the way, scholar." And with that they stepped into the ruins of Tor Yvresse, a city of ghosts. The streets of Tor Yvresse were haunted, not by specters at least, not ones that could be seen, but by something far worse. Echoes. Kaelith could feel them as they walked, the way the mist clung to the buildings, the way the air itself seemed to whisper in voices long lost to time. As they passed through an archway, Kaelith heard a sound that did not belong in the present, the clang of battle, the screams of the dying. But when he turned, there was nothing, only the mist. Aelith frowned, gripping his sword. "Kaelith, tell me you hear that." Kaelith nodded slowly. The city remembers. The first guardian. They reached the heart of the ruins, an ancient plaza dominated by a half-collapsed tower, its once glorious banners now nothing but tattered silk caught in the wind. At the center of the plaza stood a statue, a warrior clad in flowing Asur robes, his hands resting upon the hilt of a greatsword, his eyes hollow and lifeless. Kaelith froze. He recognized the inscription at the statue's base. "Here lies Nalith Starseer, last of the Keepers." Elric exhaled. The bastard led us right to his own grave. Kaelith stepped forward carefully, feeling the weight of magic in the air. This place was wrong. The moment his foot touched the stone before the statue, the air shivered, and the ground beneath them cracked. A low voice filled the plaza, ancient and hollow. "Who seeks the path of the echo?" The statue moved. The battle of the Starseer's rest. Stone cracked and splintered as the warrior's statue skin fell away, revealing pale, spectral flesh beneath. The greatsword in his hands flared to life, burning with arcane energy. Kaelith's breath caught in his throat. Nalith Starseer was not truly dead. He had been waiting. Aelric drew his sword. "Of course he's a ghost, of course he is." The guardian attacked. Nalith moved like a tempest, his greatsword cleaving through the mist. Kaelith barely had time to dodge, feeling the raw force of the blade's magic as it shattered the stone where he had stood a moment before. Aelric met the next strike head-on, his own blade flashing. The impact sent shockwaves through the plaza, dust and debris whirling into the air. Kaelith reached for his magic. White-hot energy surged through his veins, and he raised his hand, unleashing a blast of arcane force, only for Nalith to catch it mid-air, absorbing the spell as though it were nothing. Kaelith's stomach dropped. "He's a bloody mage warrior," Aelric snarled. "Of course he is." Nalith turned to them, his spectral eyes flaring with light. "You seek the echo. You seek to disturb the past. You must be judged." He raised his sword, and the air around them darkened. More figures emerged from the mist, other guardians, ancient Asur warriors, their forms half shadow, half bone. Kaelith cursed. "This is getting worse." Aelric spat blood. "Then let's make it worse for them." He lunged, driving his blade straight through the ribs of the nearest guardian. The spectral warrior howled, its body disintegrating into mist. Kaelith followed suit, weaving through the battle, his sword and magic striking as one. The fight was brutal. Every blow landed, burned against their very souls, as if the ghosts were tearing away their essence with every strike. Kaelith knew they couldn't win. But they didn't need to. They just needed to break through. Kaelith ducked a strike, then drove his hand against the inscription on Nalith's grave. The magic surged through him. The ground shook violently, and the ghosts reeled. For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause. Then Nalith's spectral form faltered. His voice was no longer filled with wrath, but regret. "The path is open." Then, with a final hollow sigh, he vanished, and the ruins shifted, revealing a hidden stairway leading downward into the abyss. Kaelith and Aelric stumbled back, panting, bloodied. Aelric wiped sweat from his brow. You know what. Next time, let's let Selithra go first." Kaelith chuckled weakly, then descended the steps into the darkness. The path to Vaul's echo was finally revealed, but the price of power had only just begun. Chapter 12. The Blade of Sorcery. The depths of Yvresse. The Forbidden Gate. The air throbbed with unseen power. It was subtle at first, a gentle pressure against the skin like the caress of some unseen force, but as Selithra Duskbane descended deeper into the ruins of Yvresse, the sensation grew more oppressive, more hungry. The passage beneath the shattered city had been sealed for centuries, its entrance buried beneath fallen towers and forgotten corpses. Now, as her warband drove through the rubble, she could feel the power stirring beyond the stone. A relic of the Sundering. A secret the Asur had sought to bury. Her fingers tightened around the blackened hilt of her dagger, her breath steady despite the looming sense of unease. Behind her, Vardis Darktide muttered a curse as his corsairs pried open an ancient doorway, its surface lined with twisting, eldritch runes. The metal glowed faintly, as if resisting their touch. Selithra stepped forward. Her violet eyes narrowed, taking in the inscriptions. The words were written in a dialect even older than Elthuan, the language of the first mages. The path to Vaul's echo is sundered. Beyond this gate, the blade's price must be paid. She smiled. Everything had a price. "Open it," she ordered. Vathis hesitated. "My lady, this is something old, older than us. We don't know what." Selithra cut him off with a glare. "You think I care for the warnings of dead cowards?" Vathis bit his tongue and stepped back. The warband obeyed, their hands pressing against the metal, shoving against the runes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the symbols flared. A scream tore through the chamber, high and keening, as if the very walls were shrieking. The door did not open. Instead, it fed upon those who had dared touch it. Selithra's corsairs convulsed violently, their veins blackening as tendrils of pure darkness coiled around them, sinking into their flesh like feeding serpents. One let out a horrified wail before his skin tore apart from within, his organs liquefying in an instant. He collapsed in a heap of oozing meat, his armor clattering to the ground, empty. Another thrashed wildly, clawing at his own throat as his face twisted into something inhuman, his body warping into a grotesque mockery of life before he disintegrated into dust. Selithra did not move. She simply watched, her lips curling in amusement as the screams faded. And then the door cracked open. Beyond it, a corridor of void stretched before them, a passage not of stone, but of magic. Selithra exhaled. A portal, a shortcut, and all it had cost her was a handful of expendable men. She stepped forward, the remaining Druchii warriors watching in wary silence. Vathis stared at the remains of his men, then at Selithra. His voice was tight. "You knew?" She turned to him, smirking. "Of course I knew." And then, without hesitation, she stepped through the portal. The path of shadows. Stepping into the portal was like stepping through a wound in reality itself. The moment Selithra passed through, the air grew heavy, thick with the sensation of being watched. The walls of the corridor shifted like liquid, writhing with shapes that should not exist. Distorted faces pressed against the blackened surface, their mouths open in silent screams. Selithra heard whispers, not in Elthuan, not in Elthuan, but in a language that predated all things. A cold hand brushed her shoulder, though nothing was there. Vathis stumbled as he followed, his face pale. What is this place?" Selithra did not answer, because she knew the truth. This was not a portal in space. This was a wound in time. They were walking the echo of the Sundering itself, the guardian of the rift. As they pressed deeper into the passage, the whispers grew louder. The air burned with something unnatural. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was not alive. It was not dead. It was something in between. A warrior clad in tattered robes, his armor cracked and blackened, his eyes burning with golden fire. His voice was a chorus of thousands. "You are not meant to walk this path." Selithra smiled wickedly, drawing her blade. "Then come, Wraith," she whispered. "Try and stop me." The guardian attacked. His blade moved faster than sight, a burning brand of magic and vengeance. Selithra barely dodged, feeling the heat of his weapon sear the air beside her cheek. Vathis was not as lucky. The guardian's blade carved through him like paper, bisecting him from shoulder to hip. Blood sprayed across the blackened walls, his dying scream lost in the void. Selithra did not mourn. She did not flinch. Instead, she threw herself forward, her magic twisting the void itself. The guardian struck again, but Selithra met the blow with a shield of pure shadow, the clash of energies shaking the passageway. She could feel the portal closing behind them. This was a one-way path, a sacrifice to those who dared defy time itself. The Guardian lunged once more. Selithra smirked. She twisted her wrist, and her dagger plunged into his spectral heart. The Guardian froze. A moment passed, then another. His body shuddered violently, his golden fire flickering, and then with a final hollow scream, his form disintegrated into dust. Selithra exhaled, rolling her shoulders. Pathetic. She turned to the remaining survivors. Only a handful had made it through the rift unscathed. The rest? Dead. Gone. Forgotten. She stepped forward, looking ahead, and there it was. The portal had opened onto a massive cavern, the air filled with a golden, pulsating light. At the far end, carved into the rock, stood an ancient doorway, sealed by runes of immense power. Selithra felt a thrill run through her blood. The vault of Yvresse. The Asur was still behind, and she had already reached the final gate. She turned to the ruins, smiling. The echo of Vaul was within reach, and all she had to do was take it. Chapter 13. A War of Wills. The Siege of Yvresse, a city on the brink. Yvresse was dying. The once great citadel, carved into the cliffs of Ulthuan's eastern coast, now stood wreathed in smoke and fire. The corsair fleet had arrived in the dead of night, their ships black against the storm-churned sea, their sails stitched from the skin of fallen enemy. Now, as the first light of dawn fought to break through the mist, the slaughter was already well underway. Kaelith Sunshadow stood upon the outer battlements, his cloak torn and stained with the blood of dying Asur. His breath was heavy, his fingers tight around the hilt of his sword, as he gazed down at the chaos unfolding below. The corsairs had breached the outer defenses. Now they poured through the lower districts, their blades flashing in the morning light, their whips cracking against azure flesh. The air was filled with screams, the acrid scent of burning wood mingling with the iron stench of blood. Beside Kaelith, Aelric Starborn wiped the sweat from his brow, his face set in a grim expression. "Varen Felway leads them," Aelric muttered. Kaelith's gaze hardened. Varian, a name that carried weight among the corsairs. A reader of legend, his ships had plundered the coasts of Ulthuan for decades, his reputation etched into the bones of every elf who had fought against him. Now he was here, at the gates of Yvresse, seeking the same prize as Kaelith, as Selithra, as all of them. The echo of Vaul. Kaelith exhaled sharply. They had found the final clue buried within the ruins. The artifact lay beneath the city itself, sealed away in the forgotten catacombs beneath Yvresse. But to reach it, they had to survive the siege first. And the corsairs were not letting them leave alive. The enemy at the gates. The corsair warbands moved through the streets like wolves tearing through dying prey. Their blades gleamed, their movements swift and cruel as they struck down any Asur defenders too slow to escape. One warrior, a grizzled veteran of Yvresse, raised his sword to block a corsair's strike, only to have his arm severed at the elbow, the corsair's curved blade spilling his lifeblood onto the cobblestones. He staggered back, gasping, but the raider was relentless. A dagger to the throat, a twist, and the warrior's head lolled unnaturally before his body collapsed in a heap. Another corsair, clad in rippled sea dragon hide, drove his serrated cutlass into the belly of an Asur mage, twisting it savagely before ripping it free, his face splattered with crimson spray. "Burn the city!" Varian's voice rang through the air, thick with malice and hunger. From the distant cliffs, corsair siege engines hurled burning tar over the walls, the streets of Yvresse erupting into walls of flame. What had once been a sanctuary of Ulthuan was now a ruined battlefield, a city caught in the grip of an unrelenting storm. Kaelith's jaw clenched. They had no choice now. If the Corsairs took the city, they would find the artifact first, and then it would be lost to the hands of butchers and thieves. He turned to Aelric. "We go now. Into the catacombs." Eldric's eyes widened. "And leave the city to burn?" Kaelith exhaled sharply. "If we stay, we die. If we go, we might still have a chance to stop whatever madness Vaul's echo will unleash." Aelric hesitated, but then nodded. "Then let's run before the fire takes us too." The ascent of Varian Fellwave. At the ruined gatehouse, Varian Fellwave stood atop a mound of corpses, his eyes gleaming with savage delight. His armor, forged from stolen elven steel, was splattered with fresh blood, his crimson cape billowing behind him. He was a monster of legend, his face carved by war, his blade stained with centuries of conquest. A Corsair captain approached him, bowing slightly. "The city is nearly ours, my lord." Varian smiled, a predator's grin. "And the Asur?" "Scattered. Their leaders are retreating beneath the ruins." Varian's expression darkened. "Then we go after them." His hand tightened around his blade, a serrated monstrosity, enchanted by the witch priests of Claire Carond, its edges hungry for the taste of elven blood. He turned to his warriors, raising the blade high. "Hunt them down. Burn everything. Leave nothing alive." The Corsairs roared in approval, their eyes alight with madness. And so the hunt began in earnest. The descent into darkness. Kaelith and his remaining warriors plunged into the depths, the entrance to the catacombs hidden beneath a ruined shrine. The tunnels were old, carved into the bones of the earth, lined with ancient glyphs long since faded by time. Aelric gritted his teeth. "This place reeks of old magic." Kaelith pressed forward, gripping the torchlight tightly. "The artifact is here. I can feel it." Behind them, the sounds of battle still raged. The Corsairs were coming. If they hesitated for even a moment, they would be cut down before they could reach their prize. The path ahead split into two, leading into deeper darkness. Kaelith turned to his warriors. "There's no turning back now," he said grimly. "We reach Vaul's echo, or we die here." Aelric grinned. "Just another day in this cursed war." Kaelith allowed himself a brief smirk. Then they moved deeper into the abyss, the weight of destiny pressing down upon them. Above them, Varian's warbands entered the ruins. And in the shadows, something ancient stirred beneath the city, waiting to be awakened once more. Chapter 14. The Siege of Yvresse. The city burns. The walls of Yvresse trembled beneath the relentless assault. The once proud jewel of Ulthuan, shrouded in its mystical mist, now stood on the brink of destruction. Smoke coiled into the sky, mingling with the wails of the dying. The Druchii war host had arrived. On the cliffs above, war horns bellowed, their deep, resonant tones echoing through the ruins. Black banners, emblazoned with the cruel insignias of Naggaroth, fluttered against the dawn winds. Selithra Duskbane watched from the shadowed edges of the battlefield, her violet eyes gleaming beneath her darkened hood. The siege had begun. She had no intention of joining the slaughter. That was Varian Fellway's task. Her goal lay beneath the city, where the true power of the Sundering slumbered. She smiled. "Let the fools bleed. I will take what truly matters." Then she vanished into the mist. The battle for the gates. Kaelith Sunshadow's sword clashed against Druchii's steel, the force of the impact rattling his bones. The air was thick with the scent of blood, the sounds of battle a chorus of death that filled the city streets. Aelric Starborn fought beside him, his armor drenched in crimson, his blade an extension of his fury. "They're pushing us back!" Aelric bellowed, driving his sword through a Corsair's chest, the blade bursting from the Druchii's back in a spray of gore. Kaelith gritted his teeth, parrying a wicked, curved dagger before slashing his attacker's throat open. "We hold the line," he roared. The Druchii surged forward, relentless and without mercy. From atop the walls, Asur archers rained death upon the invaders, their arrows piercing Druchii throats and chests, felling them in droves. But it was not enough. The siege engines had reached the gates. The first battering ram struck, shaking the very foundations of the city. Kaelith's stomach tightened. The gates would not hold for long. The streets run red. The first Druchii breach came in an explosion of shattered wood. Corsairs poured through the broken gate, their blades flashing in the dim light. An Asur warrior tried to block their path, only for a barbed whip to lash around his neck. He gagged, clawing at the weapon, cutting into his throat, before he was ripped off his feet and dragged screaming into the mass of Druchii warriors. Kaelith lunged, his sword flashing as he severed the whip-wielding Corsair's arm at the elbow. The Druchii raider howled, falling to his knees just as Kaelith drove his blade into the warrior's skull, the tip bursting from his jaw. Aelric fought like a storm given form, his great sword cleaving through flesh and bone, his movements precise and brutal. A Druchii spearman lunged at him, but Aelric caught the shaft mid-thrust, twisting it violently before ramming it back through the Druchii's throat. Blood spurted onto the broken cobblestones. Aelric kicked the dying warrior aside, panting. "We can't hold them here," he shouted. Kaelith cursed, cutting down another raider before stepping back toward the next defensive line. They had minutes, at best, and somewhere in the city Selithra was already hunting the artifact. The Undercroft, the path to power. The deeper Selithra descended, the more she could feel it. Vaul's echo. Its pulse rippled through the stone, an ancient heartbeat that had been sealed away since the Sundering itself. The Asur had tried to hide it, bury it beneath layers of magic and stone, but nothing remained lost forever. She passed through a long forgotten antechamber, the walls etched with faded runes, their light dim and flickering. The air was thick with power that had not been touched in millennia. Vartha's Darktide, her last remaining lieutenant, followed behind her, his sword drawn. His face was tense, his usual arrogance replaced with unease. "My lady," he muttered, "this place, it is not meant for us." Selithra smirked. "It is meant for those who take what they desire." The passage ended before a great obsidian door, its surface lined with intricate wards, their glow pulsing erratically. The final seal upon Vaul's echo. Selithra raised her hand, whispering the words of unbinding. The runes flared in protest, ancient wards cracking beneath her sorcery. Then, a howl of fury shook the chamber. The door shattered, not outward, but inward, as if some great force had been waiting for release. From the darkness beyond, something shifted. Something ancient. Something hungry. The gate falls. Above ground, the gates of Yvresse finally collapsed. Varian Fellwave strode through the wreckage, his blades slick with Asur blood, his eyes burning with triumph. The city was his. He would claim its wealth, its secrets. And if the rumors were true, if the artifact was truly hidden beneath Yvresse, then he would take that as well. He raised his sword high. Burn it all. The awakening below. Selithra stepped forward, her heart thrumming with anticipation. The chamber beyond the shattered door was vast, stretching into endless shadow. And at its center, resting upon an ancient pedestal, lay the blade of legend. Vaul's echo. Its surface was cracked, flickering with an otherworldly glow, as if the metal itself was struggling to remain whole. Selithra smiled. "Mine." She reached forward, and then the darkness came alive. The very walls of the chamber split open, revealing writhing tendrils of shadow, the air suddenly choked with whispers. The chamber was not unprotected. Vaul's echo had been sealed away for a reason. And now, with the wards broken, the guardian of the vault had awakened. Selithra gritted her teeth, summoning her magic as the shadows surged toward her, the very darkness screaming. She had come for power, and power always demanded a price. Chapter 15. Desperate Alliances. The last bastion of Yvresse. Smoke choked the air, turning the skies above Tor Yvresse into a swirling nightmare of black and crimson. The Druchii invaders flooded through the city's ruined gates, their blades dripping with the blood of fallen Asur defenders. Kaelith Sunshadow moved swiftly through the chaos, his warriors close behind. Aelric Starborn, still bleeding from his last engagement, kept pace, his greatsword slick with Druchii gore. "Where in the name of Asurian are we going?" Aelric hissed, his breath ragged. "To the citadel," Kaelith responded, eyes locked ahead. The inner keep was still standing, its towers looming over the ruins, but it wouldn't hold for long. If Kaelith had any chance of stopping Selithra from reaching Vaul's echo, he needed access to the vault beneath the city. And for that he needed permission, or a corpse to take it from. The commander's last stand. The doors of the citadel of Yvresse groaned as Kaelith shoved them open. Inside, the final defenders of the city stood in ragged formation, their silver armor stained with blood, their once pristine banners torn and burned. At their head stood Commander Telian Dawnfire, his once noble face etched with exhaustion. His left arm was bound in a makeshift sling, his golden hair matted with sweat and gore. His hardened gaze flickered toward Kaelith, then Aelric. "You have a talent for arriving when things are already lost, Sunshadow," Telian muttered. Kaelith stepped forward, unshaken. "Nothing is lost yet," he said firmly. Telian let out a dry laugh. "Look outside, boy." A distant explosion shook the walls, the sound of another Druchii siege engine hammering the gates. Telian continued. "This city is falling. Varian's corsairs have already set fire to the lower quarters, and the Druchii siege towers are crawling with monsters pulled from the depths of Naggaroth. Within the hour I'll be leading my warriors in a final charge." Kaelith set his jaw. "That would be a waste of lives," he said. "The battle is already lost." Telian's eyes burned with anger. "So you would have me kneel before the enemy?" Kaelith shook his head. "No, I would have you fight for something that matters." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know why the Druchii are here, Telian. I know what they seek." Telian frowned. "The artifact?" Kaelith nodded. "I know where it is. I need access to the vaults beneath Yvresse." Telian laughed bitterly. "The vaults?" He shook his head. "That door has been sealed for centuries. Even if you could open it, the ruins beneath the city are unstable. You'd be going to your death." Kaelith did not flinch. "Then let me go to my death." Aelric sighed, muttering under his breath. "I hate it when you talk like that." Telian studied him for a long moment. Then finally he sighed. "If I let you through, I need something in return." Kaelith nodded. "Name it." Telian's eyes darkened. "My warriors are trapped in the Eastern District. If we have any hope of mounting a final stand, I need them brought back alive." Kaelith exhaled. "How many?" 30. Aelric groaned. "I swear, you people never make this easy." Kaelith glanced at him, then turned back to Telian. Telian hesitated. Then, with a reluctant nod, he handed Kaelith a set of keys, their silver surface etched with ancient runes. "These will unlock the entrance to the vaults. They were sealed with old Asur magic, long before even my time." Kaelith took the keys. "Then I won't let them be sealed forever." A rescue in the flames. The eastern district of Yvresse was a graveyard in the making. Buildings burned, their rooftops collapsing under the weight of fire and destruction. Asur warriors fought desperately against the corsair hordes, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, and exhausted. Kaelith and Aelric did not wait. They dove into the fray, cutting a path through the Druchii raiders. The first enemy came at Kaelith fast, his blade already mid-swing. Kaelith ducked low, driving his sword straight into the Druchii's gut. The Rideau gasped, blood bubbling from his lips, but Kaelith ripped the blade free before he could make a sound, his corpse collapsing to the ground. Aelric was a whirlwind of steel, cutting through the corsairs like a storm given form. A Druchii tried to flank him, only for Aelric to slam his gauntleted fist into the raider's face, shattering his jaw. As the Druchii staggered back, Aelric drove his sword through the warrior's ribs, twisting it savagely before yanking it free. Blood spattered the cobblestones. The trapped Asur warriors rallied at the sight of their arrival. "We're getting you out of here," Kaelith called. One of the Asur defenders, a young captain with a broken helm, shook his head. "We're cut off. There's no way out." Kaelith scowled, his mind racing. Then he saw it. The collapsed rooftops. A pathway, if they moved fast enough. "This way," he called. The warriors scrambled up the ruins, leaping from shattered walls to burning rooftops, arrows whistling past them as the Druchii fired from below. One warrior was too slow. A corsair hooked him with a barbed chain, yanking him backward with brutal force. He screamed, his body dragged into the horde, and was gone. Kaelith gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to look back. By the time they reached the citadel, only 26 remained. It would have to be enough. The vault opens. Thelion met them at the gates, his expression unreadable. "You lost some." Kaelith exhaled sharply. "They died so the rest could live." Thelion nodded grimly, then turned toward the sealed door beneath the citadel, its surface etched with golden glyphs. "Then go." Kaelith didn't hesitate. He pressed the keys into the lock, feeling the ancient magic pulse against his fingertips. The door shuddered violently, resisting the intrusion, then with a final thunderous groan, it swung open. A spiral staircase descended into the abyss. Aelric looked at Kaelith. "This is the part where we regret everything, isn't it?" Kaelith smiled grimly. "Always." Then they descended into the darkness, leaving the battle behind. Selithra was already below, and soon they would face her in the heart of the vault itself. The war for Val's Echo was reaching its final act. Chapter 16. Beneath the Ruins. The Descent into Darkness. The air grew thick with dust and magic, the scent of damp stone mixing with the faint tang of something older, unnatural. Kaelith Sunshadow moved silently, his boots pressing against the worn steps of the spiral staircase as they descended into the heart of Yvresse's catacombs. Behind him, Aelric Starborn and the remaining warriors followed, their weapons drawn. Their footsteps echoed, swallowed by the vast emptiness below. The vault had been sealed for centuries. The very stone bore the weight of time itself, its walls lined with ancient Asur runes, their light flickering like dying stars. Yet now, something stirred. Something awake. Kaelith felt it before he saw it. A pulse. A rhythmic throbbing, slow but growing stronger. It was not just magic, it was power in its rawest form, vibrating through the stone, warping the very air. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage split in two. Eldric exhaled sharply. "I don't like this." Kaelith traced his fingers along the inscriptions on the walls, trying to decipher their meaning. The echo rests beneath the shattered vault. To take it is to awaken the storm. To awaken the storm is to sunder the world anew. His jaw clenched. Whatever Vaul's echo was, it was never meant to be found again. And yet Selithra was already here. The ruins shook as a distant explosion of dark magic rumbled through the tunnels. Kaelith and Aelric exchanged glances. "She's close." Then screamed. The battle had already begun. The battle beneath the ruins. The catacombs erupted with violence as Druchii and Asur warriors clashed in the darkness. Blades sang through the air, their edges catching the flickering torchlight, flashing as steel met steel. Kaelith saw one of his warriors fall, a corsair's serrated blade tearing through his throat, spraying crimson against the cold stone. The Druchii twisted the blade, wrenching it free with a wet, sickening rip. Ylric roared, hacking through the enemy, his greatsword carving a corsair in two, his viscera spilling across the ancient floor. From the shadows, shades emerged, their blackened crossbows raised. Kaelith moved first, channeling a pulse of white-hot energy, his magic blazing through the darkness. A shade screamed as the arcane fire engulfed him, his body writhing before he collapsed in a smoldering heap. Another shade loosed a bolt toward Ylric, but the warrior turned just in time, the projectile skimming his shoulder, drawing a line of blood. "Cowards!" Ylric spat, charging into the fray. A Druchii lunged at Kaelith, his twin daggers flashing. Kaelith caught the first strike, twisting his sword to parry, but the second dagger bit into his ribs, searing pain ripping through him. The Druchii grinned viciously, whispering, "You'll die like the rest of your kin." Kaelith's answer was swift and brutal. He drove his sword up beneath the corsair's ribs, his blade bursting from his back. The Druchii gasped, his mouth filling with blood, eyes wide in shock. Kaelith ripped the blade free and the body collapsed lifelessly to the floor. But there was no time to rest, because now, standing at the far end of the ruined vault, was Selithra Duskbane. Selithra's arrival. She was wreathed in shadow, the air twisting around her as she stepped forward, her violet eyes glowing with dark power. Behind her, her remaining warriors moved with lethal grace, their curved blades dripping with azure blood. Her lips curled into a mocking smile. "You're too late, Kaelith." Kaelith steadied himself, ignoring the throbbing pain in his ribs. "The artifact doesn't belong to you, witch." Selithra laughed softly, tilting her head. "Belong," she mused. "It belongs to whoever has the will to claim it." Behind her, at the center of the chamber, Vaul's echo pulsed. The blade was like no weapon Kaelith had ever seen. It was fractured, its edge splintered into twisting shards of burning metal, held together by raw, unstable magic. The closer Kaelith got, the more the air itself fought against him, warping like a storm barely contained. Ylric took one look at the artifact and muttered, "That thing shouldn't exist." Selithra stepped closer, extending a pale hand toward the blade. Kaelith's instincts screamed, "Stop her!" But Selithra was already reaching for it. The moment her fingers brushed the edge of the blade, the catacombs screamed in protest. The very walls shuddered, and then the world exploded into chaos. The artifact unleashed. A shockwave burst outward, a wave of black and gold energy that ripped through the chamber. Kaelith was thrown backward, crashing into a crumbling pillar. The stone shattered on impact, dust and debris raining around him. Ylric slammed into the ground beside him, coughing. The Druchii warriors were not as lucky. The ones closest to the blast disintegrated instantly, their bodies reduced to nothing but ash. Even Selithra staggered, her form flickering, as if the power of the blade was too much even for her. She let out a hiss of pain but did not let go. Instead she laughed. A deep, twisting laugh, filled with power and madness. "You see now, Kaelith," she whispered. The runes along the chamber walls began to crack, the ancient magic failing. The catacombs were collapsing. Ylric groaned, pushing himself up. "Tell me we're leaving." Kaelith looked toward the artifact, toward Selithra. The war was no longer about who controlled it. It was about who survived it. He tightened his grip on his sword. Not yet. Because if Selithra claimed Vaul's echo, The world would burn. Chapter 17. The Breaking of Wards. The Howl of the Dead. The moment Selithra's fingers grazed Vaul's echo, the warding runes carved into the catacomb walls ruptured like shattering glass. The vault screamed, not in any mortal tongue, but in the raw, agonized wail of 1,000 sundered souls, their torment echoing through the ancient stone. Kaelith staggered, pressing his hands over his ears, his mind drowning in the sheer force of it. Beside him, Aelric Starborn cursed, his greatsword shaking in his grip. Selithra gasped, jerking her hand away from the blade as the ground beneath them cracked apart. And then the wraiths came, the unleashing of the sundered. From the crumbling walls, shadows coalesced, shifting figures of long-dead elves, their armor tarnished, their eyes voids of burning light. They had been warriors once, Asur and Druchii both, brothers in life, enemies in death. And now they rose again, bound by the very magic that had sealed Vaul's echo away for millennia. A Druchii shade barely had time to react before one of the wraiths lunged, its spectral blade plunging through his chest. He screamed, his body shriveling instantly, flesh withering as the wraith fed upon his essence. His corpse collapsed into dust, his soul consumed entirely. Another Ashu warrior raised his sword to defend himself, but the wraith's blade passed straight through the steel, through his armor, through his flesh. He froze, mouth opening in a silent gasp. Then his eyes turned black, his soul sucked into the void, leaving behind only an empty husk. Kaelith's breath came fast. "They're not just killing us," he murmured. "They're devouring us." The battle against the forgotten. Chaos erupted. Druchii and Asur abandoned their battle, their weapons now turned toward the wraiths instead of each other. Aelric slashed through a wraith, but his sword passed harmlessly through its form, as if striking smoke. The wraith turned on him, lifting a hand wreathed in sickly green fire. Kaelith reacted instantly, channeling a burst of arcane energy, his spell crashing into the wraith's form. The creature shrieked, its essence torn apart by the raw force of his magic. Aelric gasped, his hands trembling. Magic. They can be killed with magic. Selithra was already moving, her own dark sorcery twisting through the air. She lashed out, sending waves of violet fire crashing against the wraiths. One by one they howled and unraveled, their forms dispersing into nothingness. For a moment, the battle balanced on a knife's edge. Then, the largest of the wraiths emerged. A towering figure, its armor cracked and blackened, its eyes burning with golden light. Its voice was many voices, layered upon itself. "You have defiled this place, and now you shall join us." With a single motion it raised its blade, and the entire chamber shook. The chamber collapses. The ceiling split apart, sending jagged shards of rock plummeting down. Druchii and Asur alike dove for cover, some too slow to escape. A corsair was crushed instantly, his scream lost beneath the weight of falling debris. Aelric shoved Kaelith aside, barely dodging a cascade of stone. Kaelith gritted his teeth, his heart pounding. They couldn't stay here. The wraiths were unrelenting, the chamber was falling apart, and his gaze flickered toward the center of the ritual circle. There, finally fully exposed, lay Vaul's echo. Its form was fractured, its surface glowing with unstable energy. The sword looked as if it had been shattered and reforged 1,000 times over, its edges flickering between reality and something else. It was not meant to exist in this world. And yet, here it was. Kaelith locked eyes with Selithra across the battlefield. She knew it too. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then, they lunged at the same time. The fight for the echo. Selithra struck first, her dagger whipping toward Kaelith's throat, wreathed in black flame. He dodged, twisting aside as he brought his sword up, aiming for her ribs. She vanished in a swirl of shadows, reappearing behind him, her blade already descending toward his spine. Kaelith reacted on instinct, summoning a barrier of light, her strike glancing off as he countered with a burst of magic. Selithra hissed, forced back, her violet eyes burning with fury. "You should have died in Ulthuan, Kaelith," she spat. Kaelith didn't answer. He pressed forward, his blade singing through the air, forcing her back with each strike. Ylric was fighting to reach them, cutting down Druchii warriors who stood in his path. "Kaelith, the whole damned vault is coming down." But Kaelith couldn't stop. Not until Selithra twisted her magic, pulling the shadows of the collapsing ruins into her grasp. A maelstrom of darkness exploded around her, tendrils lashing outward, tearing apart anything in their wake. Kaelith barely held his ground, his magic flickering under the force of the attack. But then, Vaul's echo pulsed again, and this time the shockwave knocked them both off their feet. The final stand. Kaelith landed hard, his vision blurring. The entire vault was shaking violently, the wraiths howling, their essence unraveling as the magic of the echo consumed them. Selithra gasped, struggling to rise. And there, between them, the sword waited. It hummed with unnatural energy, as if aware of the moment, as if choosing who would claim it. Kaelith's hand twitched. Selithra's eyes flickered with desperation and hunger. Both of them moved at once. Their fingers brushed the hilt of Vaul's echo, and the world exploded into fire and shadow. Chapter 18. The Sundering's Truth. A rift in reality. The moment Kaelith's and Selithra's fingers touched the hilt of Vaul's echo, the world collapsed inward. A soundless detonation of energy erupted from the blade, a pulse of raw, violent magic that did not explode outward, but rather imploded, dragging everything into itself. Kaelith barely had time to scream before his vision was ripped away. The catacombs, the battle, the wraiths, Ylric's voice calling his name. All of it ceased to exist, and in its place came the past. A vision of the Sundering. Kaelith gasped, his body weightless, his mind unmoored from time. He was standing on nothingness, an endless expanse of swirling black and gold stormlight, fragmented images shifting and breaking apart around him. It was not a dream. It was memory, but not his own. Beside him, Selithra was there too, her expression momentarily dazed before she clenched her fists and snarled, "What sorcery is this?" Then the first image took form. It was Ulthuan, but not as it was now. It was whole, untouched by war. The jewel of the world before the Sundering had torn it asunder. Kaelith could see the great towers of Toralessi, the pristine white walls of Sapphire, the golden banners of the Phoenix King fluttering beneath an unmarred sky. The world before the schism, and then, via, the sky darkened, splitting apart as the heavens bled crimson and violet. The seas roared, rising like titanic walls, smashing against the shores of Ulthuan. Cities burned, their spires crumbling under the force of magical devastation. And in the heart of it all, Kaelith saw it. The rift, a wound in reality itself, splitting the very foundation of the world. It did not tear in a straight line, it was fractured, an ever-widening abyss of howling darkness, dragging everything into its void. Ulthuan on one side, Naggaroth on the other, and in between them, Vaul's echo. Not just a blade, not just a weapon, but a fragment of the rift itself, a shard of the very moment the world had been broken. Kaelith's breath caught in his throat. This is the true cause of the Sundering, the gods' betrayal. The vision shifted again, pulling them deeper. They stood on the ruined battleground, the very place where the war had reached its crescendo. Before them stood two figures, one clad in golden armor, the other in midnight black plate. Kaelith knew them instantly, though neither he nor Selithra spoke their names. Calidor Dragon-Tummer, Maliketh the Witch King, and between them, Vaul's echo floated, untouched, its surface burning with power too great for any mortal to wield. But it had already been wielded. The truth was etched into the air, the moment frozen in the raw magic of the vision. Vaul's echo had been the key to the war itself. It was not a mere weapon, nor was it forged by any mortal hands. It was the remnant of something greater, something never meant to exist in a single realm, and its very presence had split the world apart. The High Elves had sought to contain it, to lock it away beneath layers of wards and magic, believing they could undo the damage. The Druchii had fought to claim it, believing it could remake the world in their image. Neither side had won. Neither side had been meant to win. The Sundering had never been a war of conquest. It had been a war over something neither side understood. Selithra's face twisted with fury as she watched. "They lied to us," she whispered, her voice laced with venom and revelation. "All of them. The Asur, the Druchii. We have always been fighting over a lie." Kaelith said nothing, 'cause she was right. Yet, the vision was not done. The price of power, the final moment, played before them. Kaelith and Selithra watched as Kalidor and Malekith both reached for the blade at the same time, just as they had. The instant their hands touched its surface, the rift reacted, sending out a final cataclysmic pulse. The very fabric of existence split apart, and the world shattered. The vision collapsed, the storm of memories spiraling inward, dragging them both back into the present. The return to reality. Kaelith gasped as he awoke, the sensation of weight crashing back into his body. His vision blurred. The vault was still collapsing, chunks of stone crashing down around them, the echoes of war still raging above. But none of that mattered, because Vaul's echo was still in his hands. And now he understood. Selithra staggered to her feet, her expression wild, her eyes still flickering with the remnants of what they had seen. She looked at Kaelith, and for the first time there was no mockery in her gaze. Only understanding. Only hatred. Hatred not for him, but for the war they had both been born into. "This changes nothing, Sunshadow," she hissed. "I will still take it." Kaelith clenched his fingers around the blade's fractured hilt, feeling the raw energy thrumming beneath his palm. "Then you didn't see what I did. The artifact was not a gift. It was not a weapon. It was a curse, and whoever held it would carry the weight of the Sundering forever." The catacombs shook violently, the entire chamber beginning to implode. There is no time left. Kaelith turned toward the only remaining path out. "We need to go, now." But Selithra only laughed, even as the ruins fell around them. She wasn't running. She had already made her choice. And the next time they met, only one of them would leave alive. Chapter 19. The Druchii's Gambit. The Fracturing of Reality. Selithra stood motionless as the vault crumbled around her, her violet eyes fixed upon Vaul's echo. The artifact pulsed, its surface fractured and unstable, glowing with an unnatural black-gold radiance. Kaelith felt it too, the sheer wrongness of it. The power in the blade was not like any mortal enchantment. It was something else entirely, something that had existed before the world had even taken shape. And now it was awakening again. Selithra smirked, her silver hair whipping in the violent currents of raw magic that radiated from the sword. "You fear this power, Kaelith. That is why you will never wield it." Kaelith tightened his grip on his own blade. "It isn't meant to be wielded," he shouted over the howling winds. "You saw what it did. It didn't just split Ulthuan and Naggaroth, it split time itself. Do you think you can control that?" Selithra laughed, low and dark. "I don't need to control it, I need to break it." Before Kaelith could move, she raised both hands, channeling her sorcery directly into the artifact. A ripple of pure chaos erupted from the blade, cracking the air itself. And then, everything unraveled, magic unbound. The battlefield twisted violently, the very fabric of space and time distorting. Kaelith fell to his knees as the ground beneath him warped, shifting between solid stone, liquid void, and something else entirely, something that did not belong to any mortal realm. The Druchii warriors staggered, their bodies flickering in and out of focus, their armor warping, their weapons elongating into jagged, unnatural shapes. Aelric Starborn, barely keeping his balance, gasped in horror. "Kaelith, this is wrong." It was beyond wrong. It was a catastrophe. Selithra's magic sank into Vaul's echo, forcing the blade to react violently, its unstable power feeding upon her very essence. For a brief moment, her form flickered, her body turning half shadow, half light, as if she were being pulled apart between two realities. She screamed, not in pain, but in defiance. "I am the master of this power." She thrust her arms outward, forcing the unstable energy to bend to her will. But the power did not bow. It fought back. The warped battlefield. A Druchii warrior nearby howled in agony, his body twisting grotesquely, his flesh splitting apart as tendrils of raw energy surged through him. His eyes bulged, his veins glowing with golden fire, before his body collapsed into a screaming void, disappearing entirely from existence. Another corsair tried to run, but his legs melted into the stone, fusing with the shifting ground, his body pulled downward as if the earth itself was devouring him. One of Kaelith's Asur warriors collapsed, his body shaking violently as his face contorted, turning into a mask of agony and confusion. Kaelith turned, his breath catching. The warrior was speaking, but not in any language known to elves. His voice was layered, thousands of voices overlapping, speaking the tongues of gods and monsters alike. Then his body shattered like glass, breaking into fragments of light and shadow. Kaelith staggered back, horrified. This wasn't just magic. This was the breaking of reality itself. Selithra's ascendance and her undoing. Selithra stood at the heart of the maelstrom, her eyes blazing, her body half dissolving into the storm of magic that now surrounded her. She looked unstoppable, power coiling around her like a second skin. Kaelith could feel it. She was on the verge of something else. She was becoming something else. But then, the power turned on her. The unstable nature of Vaul's echo refused to be harnessed. Selithra's triumphant expression twisted as she realized what was happening. No, the energy that had once answered her call was now draining her, feeding upon her life essence as if she were nothing more than fuel for its hunger. Her flesh cracked, splitting like fractured porcelain, veins of pure golden light spreading across her arms, her legs, her face. She let out a shrieking wail, clutching at her own body, as if she could hold herself together. Her warriors, the ones still alive, watched in horror, unable to help. The artifact was eating her alive. Kaelith stepped forward, ignoring the pain in his head, the swirling distortion around him. "Selithra, let it go." She whipped toward him, her expression one of pure rage and despair. "I will not be defeated." She forced more magic into the artifact, pushing past the limits of her body, past the limits of sanity itself. And that was when the first rift tore open. A glimpse beyond the veil. A jagged wound in reality split open above the battlefield. It was not like a normal portal. It was a gaping maw of oblivion, showing glimpses of something else, something far beyond mortal comprehension. Kaelith saw visions flashing within the rift. A future where Ulthuan burned, consumed by the very power Selithra was trying to claim. A past where Vaul himself stood, hammering something far worse than a blade. An endless abyss where the stars themselves screamed in agony. It was too much. The world was coming apart at the seams. Kaelith made his choice. With everything he had left, he lunged for Vaul's echo. Selithra saw him, too late to stop him. Their hands clashed over the hilt once more, and the energy detonated outward in a final, catastrophic shockwave. The collapse. The battlefield imploded, reality twisting as the rift sealed itself violently, cutting off whatever horrors lurked beyond. Selithra was thrown backward, her body slamming into the ruins, blood bursting from her lips. Kaelith hit the ground hard, gasping, his vision swimming. The energy from Vaul's echo had faded to a dull pulse, but the damage was already done. The battlefield was in ruins, half the warriors, Druchii and Asur alike, lost to the void or twisted beyond recognition. Kaelith struggled to his feet, searching the rubble. Selithra was gone. Not dead. Not yet. But she had lost. But now, Elric stumbled toward him, his armor scorched, his face lined with exhaustion. Kaelith, what in the name of Azurian just happened? Kaelith looked at the broken world around him, at the bodies left behind. And he knew. This wasn't just about a blade anymore. It was about undoing the past before it destroyed everything. And Selithra would never stop hunting him now. The war was far from over. Chapter 20. Cataclysm Unleashed. The echo screams. The moment Vaul's echo pulsed, the world fractured. Kaelith staggered back, his hands still tingling from the last burst of raw, chaotic power that had erupted from the sword. The air itself shuddered, warping unnaturally as if reality had been wounded beyond repair. The artifact no longer simply glowed, it burned, its surface splintering like shattered glass, cracks of black and gold light crawling along its form, feeding into the atmosphere. And then the storm began. A wave of arcane devastation exploded outward, a shock wave of such magnitude that every living thing in the ruins of Yvresse was thrown off their feet. Kaelith hit the ground hard, his breath stolen from his lungs. Elric Starborn landed beside him, coughing, his face bloodied, his armor dented and blackened from the magical backlash. And everywhere, chaos consumed the battlefield. Yvresse in ruins. The sky split open, a crack of blinding golden white energy, ripping through the mist-shrouded heavens. From the jagged tear in reality, bolts of wild magic crashed into the city, burning through stone and steel alike, turning once proud elven towers into molten ruin. A beam of searing arcane fire lanced through the central plaza, turning a group of Druchii corsairs into shrieking husks, their flesh and bone reduced to glowing embers before they even had time to react. On the far side of the ruins, a unit of Asur warriors barely had time to raise their shields before a second bolt struck, warping the very ground beneath them into a vortex of molten glass. They screamed as their bodies were dragged down, their flesh fusing with the liquefied stone, their armor melting into their very bones. High above, the remnants of Yvresse's great wards, ancient protective spells placed centuries ago, flickered and failed, their collapse sending ripples of uncontrolled energy through the city, distorting time and space itself. Kaelith watched as the once glorious sky bridges that connected Yvresse's towers bent and twisted, caught in an impossible loop where they snapped apart and reformed in the blink of an eye, reality repeating itself in maddening, broken fragments. Elric grabbed Kaelith's shoulder, his voice hoarse. "We have to move." Kaelith forced himself to stand, even as his body screamed in protest. "Where's Selithra?" Elric turned, eyes scanning the battlefield. The answer came in the form of a furious, agonized shriek from the far side of the ruins. Selithra Duskbane was still alive, but she was not victorious. Selithra's defeat. The Druchii sorceress knelt among the ruins, her once pristine armor cracked and blackened, her pale skin marred with the burns of uncontrolled magic. She was shaking, her hands grasping at the air, as if trying to pull the power back into herself. But Vaul's echo no longer obeyed her. The artifact hovered above the ground, pulsing erratically, its very essence rejecting her attempts to command it. Selithra let out a feral scream, her magic lashing out wildly, only to be repelled by the very power she sought to control. A wall of shadow flame burst outward, but it did not go toward Kaelith. It turned on Selithra herself. She gasped, her own sorcery turning against her, the raw, unstable energy twisting through her veins. Her warriors, those who still lived, could only watch in horrified silence as their mistress clutched her own throat, her body writhing under the force of her own arrogance. Then, in a final detonation of magic, Selithra was hurled backward, slamming into the remains of a ruined statue. She did not move. Elric let out a breath of disbelief. Is she? Kaelith clenched his jaw. Not dead. Not yet. But she's lost the fight. For now. But the storm was not finished. And if they did not leave now, no one would live to see another day. The retreat. The battlefield was no longer a place of war. It was a killing ground, a maelstrom of raw destruction. Both Asur and Druchii alike ceased their battle, their swords forgotten, their only thought now focused on survival. Kaelith watched as corsairs fled toward their burning ships, only for the waves themselves to rise unnaturally high, slamming into the war galleys with the force of an earthquake, snapping their hulls like kindling. Others ran through the streets, only to be caught in time loops, their bodies trapped in endless cycles of dying and reliving their deaths over and over again. And still Vaul's echo pulsed, each heartbeat of the artifact sending another shockwave of destruction through the city. Elric grabbed Kaelith's arm, his voice urgent. We have to go now. Kaelith looked at the artifact one last time. He could still feel its call, its power reaching for him, for anyone foolish enough to take it. For the briefest moment, a part of him considered it. Then he tore his gaze away. He would not make the same mistake as Selithra. To the tunnels, he ordered. They ran, weaving through the shattered ruins, their remaining warriors falling in beside them. The last remnants of Yvresse, Asur and Druchii alike, fled together, all pretenses of war forgotten in the face of annihilation. Kaelith did not look back. Because Tor Yvresse was gone, there would be no victory here. Only ruins, dust, and echoes of the past that had finally swallowed the city whole. The final collapse. As they reached the tunnel exit, Kaelith risked one final glance. Through the smoke and swirling magic he saw Vaul's echo, still floating in the air, pulsing like a dying heart. And, lying beneath the wreckage, barely clinging to consciousness, was Selithra. Her eyes met his, and even across the battlefield, he could see the promise in them. This was not over. Not yet. The storm reached its crescendo, the sky shattering with light. And then the ruins of Tor Yvresse collapsed in on themselves, sealing away whatever was left beneath the weight of stone and fire. Kaelith turned and fled into the tunnels. Behind him, Yvresse died, and the wolf of Vaul's echo was just beginning. Chapter 21. Escape from Yvresse. The dead city, Tor Yvresse, was gone. The once magnificent city, its mist-shrouded towers and enchanted bridges, lay in ruin. The sky churned with storm fire, golden lightning cracking across the heavens, arcs of unstable magic splintering through the collapsing remains. The artifact's influence had not faded. It was still tearing through reality itself, sending pulses of raw energy through the ground, splitting the ruins apart like fractured glass. Kaelith Sunshadow ran through the crumbling tunnels, his warriors barely keeping pace. Behind him, the dying city collapsed inward, the ancient streets swallowed by black chasms of warping time and space. But Kaelith's mind was not on escape. His mind was on Vaul's echo, because if they left it behind, if they abandoned it now, another Sundering would come. And this time it would not split continents, it would split existence itself. The flight through the ruins. Aelric Starborn's breath came ragged as they sprinted through the tunnels, the air thick with dust and heat. "Kaelith," he shouted between gasps, "the city is gone. We have to leave it behind." Kaelith's jaw clenched. "We can," Aelric cursed, blocking a falling chunk of stone with his shield as they reached a split in the tunnel. "Kaelith, listen to me. There's nothing left to save." Kaelith's blood burned with defiance. "If we leave it unsealed, it will happen again." Aelric turned, grabbing his friend by the shoulders, his eyes desperate. "You think we can fix this? That thing is beyond us, Kaelith, beyond any of us." Kaelith's mind raced, flashes of the vision from Vaul's echo still haunting his thoughts. The rift. The first Sundering. The lie that had started the war. Everything led back to this artifact. If they left it unsealed, someone would claim it again. The Druchii, the Asur, the Corsairs. It didn't matter who, someone would take it. And if Selithra got to it first, he could not allow it. Kaelith gritted his teeth, stepping back. "I'm going back," he said. Ulrich stared at him. "You're out of your mind." Kaelith did not argue. Maybe he was. But he knew if he turned away now, everything they had fought for would be meaningless. Aelric's expression twisted with frustration, then at last resignation. "Fine," he growled. "Then I guess I'm going to die with you." Kaelith smirked, gripping his friend's shoulder. "Not today." Then they turned and ran back into the collapsing ruins. The dead rise again. The path back to Vaul's echo was not empty. As the ruins shook, the very walls of the catacombs split open, and from the fissures, the dead poured forth. Not specters, not mere wraiths, but something worse. The twisted remnants of those who had fallen in the first Sundering, caught between time and oblivion. A former Asur noble, his face frozen in eternal agony, his flesh burned black from the arcane storm, lunged toward them. His voice was garbled, his mouth moving in ancient screams, but no sound escaped his throat. Aelric didn't hesitate. His blade flashed, cleaving through the thing's chest. But it did not fall. It did not even bleed. Kaelith thrust his hand forward, a blast of pure magic surging from his palm. The spell tore through the creature, unraveling it into nothingness. But for every one that fell, more crawled from the darkness. They were not defending Vaul's echo. They were drawn to it. Kaelith understood now. The artifact wasn't just a fragment of the Sundering. It was a wound that never healed, and the dead were still bleeding from it. The final chamber. They reached the ruins of the vault, the chamber where the battle had begun, or rather what was left of it. Most of the ceiling was gone, exposing the storm-torn sky above. Lightning and fire raged overhead, twisting in unnatural arcs. And at the center of the devastation, Vaul's echo floated above the ground, humming like a living thing, flickering between solid steel and unformed energy. Selithra was already there. She was barely standing, her form scarred and burned by the failed attempt to claim the artifact. Blood dripped from her lips, but her violet eyes still burned with defiance. Kaelith and Aelric raised their weapons. Selithra smiled weakly. "I wondered if you'd be foolish enough to return," she murmured, staggering forward. Kaelith didn't hesitate. "We're sealing it away." Selithra laughed, even as she wiped the blood from her mouth. "You think that's even possible?" Kaelith tightened his grip on his sword. "I think we have to try." Selithra's smile faded. Then she raised her hand, and the final battle for Vaul's echo began. The duel in the ruins. Selithra moved first, hurling a blast of violet lightning. Kaelith dodged, the energy scorching the air where he had stood moments before. Aelric charged, his greatsword arcing toward her throat. But Selithra vanished in a swirl of shadows, reappearing behind him, her dagger slashing toward his spine. Aelric barely turned in time, blocking the strike with the flat of his blade, the force sending him skidding backward. Kaelith summoned his own magic, a pulse of raw, golden energy bursting from his hands, colliding with Selithra's form. She screamed, her body wreathing in magical fire, but still she refused to fall. She lunged, her dagger aiming for Kaelith's heart. But this time he was faster. He stepped forward, twisting his blade low and fast, catching her across the stomach. Selithra gasped, blood spilling from her lips, staggering backward. She clutched at her wound, her eyes flickering with disbelief. Kaelith pointed his sword at her chest, breathing heavily. "It's over, Selithra." Her gaze darkened, and then, for the first time, she looked afraid. Not of Kaelith, not of dying, but of the artifact still pulsing behind them, because it was not finished yet. Vaul's echo pulsed one last time, and the final shockwave of destruction erupted outward. Kaelith barely had time to brace himself before the entire city collapsed into the abyss. Chapter 22. The Price of Ambition. A land of mist and secrets. The winds of Sapphire howled through the narrow mountain pass, twisting around jagged peaks like the whispers of long-forgotten gods. The land itself was alive with magic, its very stones etched with ancient runes, its air thick with the lingering essence of 1,000 lost spells. And through the mist-shrouded heights, Kaelith Sunshadow fled. His body ached from battle, the wounds on his arms still raw, the weight of Vaul's echo pressing against his soul like an unforgiving specter. He could feel the artifact's pulse, its shattered form still humming with power, bound to him in ways that defied mortal comprehension. He did not want it, but he could not leave it behind. Not now, not while she still hunted him. Behind him, far in the distance, he could still hear the war horns of the Druchii, a reminder that Selithra Duskbane still lived. And she was coming for him. The shadow in pursuit. Selitra's vision swam with pain. The wound in her stomach burned, the gash from Kaelith's sword deep enough to have killed a lesser elf. But she was not a lesser elf. She was Druchii, and she did not stop. Wrapped in a blood-stained cloak, her hands still crusted with dried gore, she climbed the treacherous slopes of Sapphire, following the fading echo of the artifact's power. Every step sent a fresh wave of agony through her body. Her warriors had abandoned her. Those who had survived Yvresse's collapse had fled, believing her dead, or worse, believing that her failure had made her unworthy of their allegiance. Fools. They had never understood. They had never felt it. But she had. The moment her hands had grazed the surface of Vaul's echo, she had seen it, the past, the truth, the lie upon which the world had been built. And she knew beyond doubt that it had always been meant for her. Kaelith did not deserve it. Kaelith did not even want it. That alone was proof that it should be hers. She pressed forward, eyes burning with obsession, her heart pounding with hatred and desire in equal measure. She would take what was rightfully hers, no matter the cost. The mountain of blades. Kaelith reached the upper ridge, his breath coming ragged as he emerged from the mists. Before him stood an ancient ruin, half buried in the jagged mountainside, a forgotten Asur outpost, abandoned centuries ago, its pillars cracked, its towers crumbling into dust. But the magic here was still strong. He could feel it thrumming in the air, woven into the very stones beneath his feet. This place had once been a bastion of the mages of Hoth, a place of learning, of secrets, of power. And now it would be his final stand. Aelric Starborn appeared at his side, panting, his gauntleted hand gripping his sword hilt tightly. "Tell me we're not going to fight her here," Aelric muttered, scanning the desolate ruins. Kaelith wiped the blood from his brow, his gaze fixed on the path below. "She won't stop," he said simply. Aelric exhaled sharply. "Then let's end this." And then the first arrows struck the stone beside them, shattering on impact. Selithra had arrived. A duel of fates. She emerged from the mist like a spectre, her armor dented and scorched, her face drawn but unbroken. Her violet eyes locked onto Kaelith, brimming with fury and something even deeper. Madness, hunger, obsession. "Give it to me." Her voice was low, raw. Kaelith drew his sword. "No." Selithra smiled coldly, blood dripping from the corner of her mouth. "Then I will take it from your corpse." She lunged forward, faster than a viper striking its prey. Kaelith barely blocked the first attack, her dagger sliding against his sword, sparks flying as steel met steel. Elric moved to intercept her, but before he could reach her, Selithra threw her free hand outward, a wave of violet-black magic hurling him backward into the ruins. Kaelith had no time to check if Elric still lived. Selithra was already pressing the attack, her blade a whirlwind of deadly precision, each strike aimed to kill, not wound. Kaelith parried, barely dodging, his heart hammering as he realized she was faster than before. Her wound should have slowed her down, but it hadn't. If anything, it had made her stronger. She was feeding off the magic of the artifact, drawing its energy into herself, using it to push past the limits of her broken body. Kaelith twisted, countering, driving his sword forward in a sharp, precise lunge aimed for her heart. Selithra spun away, her blade slicing toward his side. Kaelith blocked, barely. Then she drove her knee into his ribs. Kaelith choked, staggering back as pain flared through his body. Selithra didn't hesitate. She slammed her dagger toward his throat. Kaelith barely ducked. The dagger carved a thin line along his cheek, blood dripping onto the stone. Selithra licked her lips, eyes wild. "You're tired, Sunshadow," she whispered. "You feel it, don't you? The weight of the blade, the pull of its power." "It wants me," Kaelith panted, his vision swimming, the magic around them twisting the air itself. She was winning, not because she was stronger, but because she was willing to break herself to claim power. And if he didn't stop her now, she would take the blade, and no one would be able to stop what came next. The final strike. Kaelith tightened his grip, forcing his body to move, ignoring the pain, ignoring the exhaustion. Selithra lunged again, and this time Kaelith was ready. He let her get too close, her dagger mere inches from his throat. Then he turned, twisting his sword, using his own momentum to drive the blade through her side. Selithra gasped, her body jerking violently as steel punched through her ribs, blood bursting from her lips. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Kaelith pressed closer, his voice a whisper. "It was never yours to take." Then he ripped the sword free. Selithra stumbled, her knees hitting the stone. For the first time, she looked truly afraid. She reached toward the artifact, but her fingers trembled. Kaelith stepped back, watching as her body wavered, as the strength she had stolen from the artifact abandoned her at last. She collapsed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she was not dead. Not yet. Kaelith knew she would crawl after him again, no matter the cost. But for now the battle was won, and Vaul's echo was still in his hands. The war was not over, but for the first time he knew what had to be done. Chapter 23. The Phoenix Court's Judgment. The Ascent to the White Tower. Kaelith Sunshadow had not seen the White Tower of Hoeth in years. It had been his home once, the place where he had spent his youth studying magic, history, and the wisdom of ages. But now it felt foreign, as if the very air of the place had changed. As he and Elric Starborn rode toward its gates, Kaelith could feel the weight of his burden pressing down upon him. He clutched the shrouded artifact beneath his cloak, its presence still pulsing faintly against his skin. Vaul's echo was not quiet. Not even now. As they reached the immense gates of the tower, carved from white marble and reinforced with runic wards, the guardians of Hoeth stepped forward to bar their passage. Their golden armor gleamed beneath the pale light of dawn, and their eyes held no warmth. Kaelith Sunshadow. The lead guardian's voice was calm, yet unwavering. You were not summoned here. The tower does not take kindly to uninvited guests, especially those who bring disturbance. Kaelith stiffened. You will let me through, he said firmly. I bear something that the tower must see. The guards glanced at each other, then turned as another figure emerged. A robed Master of Hoeth, his white and gold robes flowing like a river of silk. Kaelith recognized him. Lore Master Elithar, his former mentor. Elithar's gaze swept over Kaelith, noting his blood-stained cloak, his battle-worn armor, and the exhaustion in his eyes. Then his gaze shifted to the bundle beneath Kaelith's arm. He felt it instantly. The artifact's presence. Elithar's face paled. You should not have brought that here, Kaelith. Kaelith clenched his fists. I had no choice. Elithar studied him a moment longer, and then he turned. Come. The gathering of the sages. The Council of Lore Masters convened in the great chamber of the White Tower, beneath the towering vaults of enchanted crystal, where books older than kingdoms lined the shelves. Kaelith stood before them, his face hardened with resolve. Before him sat 5 of the most powerful sages of Ulthuan, their robes embroidered with arcane sigils, their gazes sharp and piercing. The artifact lay before them, still wrapped in cloth, but its presence filled the room like a storm barely contained. Elithar was the first to speak. You are a fool, Kaelith, he said, his voice cold. You should have cast it into the deepest abyss you could find, and left it buried forever. Kaelith's fingers tightened. If I had left it in Yvresse, someone else would have found it. One of the lore masters, Serathis Moonfire, frowned. And what would you have us do with it then? Seal it in our archives as if that would be enough? Another, Laranel of Sapphire, sighed. This weapon should have never been forged. It was not created by Vaul, but rather by the very force that split our world apart. It is not just a blade. It is a wound that cannot heal. Kaelith exhaled sharply. Then you understand. It is too dangerous to be lost again. It must be secured, here in the White Tower. For a moment there was silence. Then a new voice spoke, one colder than winter itself. No. Kaelith turned, his heart tightening as Loremaster Terran stood. Of all the council, he had always been the most ruthless, the most unyielding. And now his glacial stare was locked onto Kaelith. You think the White Tower is a vault for cursed relics, Terran said sharply. You think we can simply contain it. You are blind, Sunshadow. He turned to the others. This thing should be destroyed. It should have been shattered 1,000 years ago. Kaelith stepped forward, his voice rising. And if it cannot be destroyed? Terran's gaze darkened. Then it should be sent where none will ever reach it. Another Lord Master spoke, his voice uncertain. There is one way, the Isle of the Dead. The room fell silent. Kaelith stared at them. You want to cast it into the void itself? Terran's cold smile was answer enough. If it means ensuring no one ever wields it again, yes. Kaelith clenched his fists. There was no certainty in their choice. No guarantee that the artifact would not awaken again, even beyond the veil of mortality. But one thing was certain. If they did nothing, another war would come. A court divided. Elithar exhaled. We are divided. He looked at Kaelith. You have brought us a burden no elf should bear. You have forced our hands, Sunshadow. And now, we must choose. The Loremasters turned inward, arguing in hushed tones, their words too soft for Kaelith to hear. Aelith, standing at Kaelith's side, muttered, They're playing with fire. This is not a decision for philosophers. This is life and death. Kaelith exhaled slowly. He knew what he had to do. Before they could decide for him, before they could take the artifact away and risk losing it again, he turned to the council, his voice iron-sharp. "I will take it to the Isle of the Dead myself." Silence fell upon the chamber. Elithar looked at him, both proud and sorrowful. "Then you may never return, Kaelith." Kaelith met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "That is a price I am willing to pay." A path set in stone. The decision was made. Kaelith Sunshadow, accompanied by Aelric Starborn, would journey to the Isle of the Dead to cast Vaul's echo into the abyss beyond time itself. There was no coming back from such a journey. There were things in that place that even the lore masters feared to name. And beyond that, there was no guarantee the artifact would be destroyed. As Kaelith and Aelric left the White Tower, the mist swirled around them, whispering of fates yet unwritten. In the distance, beyond the towers of Sapphire, a dark presence still lingered, unseen but felt. Selithra still lived, and she would not let him go so easily. The final battle had not yet come, but it was waiting, and soon it would decide the fate of the world. Chapter 24. Druchii Pursuit. A Gathering Storm. The Black Ark Nightfang loomed over the coastline like a shadow upon the sea, its immense bulk blotting out the rising moon. No mere ship, the Black Ark was a floating fortress of obsidian and sorcery, its hull carved from the remains of ancient leviathans, its decks lined with blasphemous altars to Cain, the Druchii god of murder. Upon its highest balcony, beneath the withered banners of Naggaroth, stood Dreadlord Malachar Blackthorn. He was tall, imposing, clad in midnight black plate, his form wreathed in a dark aura of barely restrained fury. He had received the message from his spies. Selithra Duskbane had failed. She had promised him the artifact, she had promised victory, and instead she had delivered nothing but ruin and shame. Worse still, she had let the prize slip into the hands of an Asur whelp. Unacceptable. A Druchii lieutenant approached, bowing deeply. "My lord," the warrior said, his face tight with anticipation, "we have tracked them. Kaelith Sunshadow and his forces have entered Sapphire. They are bound for the Isle of the Dead." Malachar's lip curled. Then they marched toward their own destruction. He turned to the gathered host upon his deck. Hundreds of Druchii warriors, corsairs, executioners, and warlocks stood ready, their eyes gleaming with bloodlust and cruelty. Beside them, bound in chains of shadow steel, Selithra knelt, her body broken but unbowed. Malachar gazed down at her, his voice dripping with venom. "You promised me victory," he murmured, "and yet all I see before me is failure." Selithra lifted her head, her silver hair matted with dried blood, her violet eyes still burning with defiance. "I was not wrong, my lord," she whispered. "I have seen it. The blade is more than just a weapon. It is a key." Malachar regarded her coldly. "Then why," he asked, voice like a dagger in the dark, "do you kneel before me like a whipped dog?" Selithra smirked, even through her pain. "Because I do not need my legs to find you the prize you seek." Malachar studied her, then let out a low chuckle, a sound like grinding steel. "Very well," he said, turning to his warriors. "Prepare the fleet. We sail for Sapphire. We take the artifact by force." The Druchii war host roared, their cries rising into the night like the howls of beasts unleashed from a cage. The hunt had begun. Sapphire, a race against death. The winds howled through the mountains as Kaelith Sunshadow and Aelric Starborn led their warriors across the treacherous slopes of Sapphire. Behind them, the White Tower of Hoeth stood silent, its council having passed its judgment. They would not intervene. Kaelith had been given leave to journey to the Isle of the Dead, but he would have no aid, no army, no reinforcements. He would have only himself, Aelric, and the handful of warriors still loyal to him. But even now, as they descended into the valleys below, Kaelith felt uneasy. Aelric rode beside him, his expression grim. "You feel it too," Aelric muttered. Kaelith nodded. "The winds of magic are shifting." Aelric exhaled. "It means they're coming." And then, as if answering their fears, the first war horn sounded from the sea. Kaelith whirled toward the coastline, his heart turning to ice. The Black Ark had arrived, and upon its deck the warriors of Naggaroth were preparing to make landfall. The invasion begins. The first Druchii ships struck the shore like spears hurled from the heavens, their hulls crashing into the mist-covered beaches of Safari, their ramps descending with deadly precision. Corsairs leapt from their vessels, their curved blades gleaming, their cloaks stitched from the flayed skins of their victims. From the larger galleys, the elite executioners of Har Ganeth stepped forth, silent, black-clad killers, their massive greatswords already dripping with fresh oil, ready to be baptized in blood. And finally, upon a chariot of blackened steel, Dreadlord Malachar himself rode forth, his crimson cloak billowing as he surveyed the battlefield like a wolf descending upon helpless prey. Selithra stood beside him, her wounds hidden beneath new armor, her hands resting upon the hilts of twin daggers, her body tense with anticipation. Malachar's voice rang out across the misted valley. "Kaelith Sunshadow." His words were like a blade through the fog, carrying across the battlefield. "There is no escape. You will kneel before me, or you will be buried here." Kaelith stood firm, gripping his sword tightly. Aelric muttered, "We should have gone around the mountains." Kaelith exhaled. "It wouldn't have mattered." Aelric smirked, despite the situation. "I know. I just wanted to complain one last time before I die." Kaelith smiled grimly. "Then let's make sure it's not today." He turned to his warriors. "The Druchii come for us. They come for Vaul's echo. If we let them take it, Ulthuan will fall. The world will fall." He raised his sword. "So, we do not let them take it. We hold here, we fight, we end this." The warriors raised their weapons, their eyes hard with determination. And then the Druchii charged. The first clash. The corsairs struck first, their bladed whips lashing out, their curved swords hunting for flesh. Kaelith parried, twisting aside as a Druchii blade whistled past his throat, countering with a swift riposte that sliced through the corsair's wrist, sending his severed hand spiraling into the dirt. Aelric roared, his greatsword cleaving through two Druchii warriors at once, their torsos shearing apart in a spray of crimson. The executioners moved in next, their greatswords swinging in deadly arcs, each blow meant to be head or disembowel. Kaelith barely dodged the first strike, his own blade clashing against the executioner's, the impact jarring his bones. The war had begun in earnest. But Kaelith knew this was not the true battle. That battle would come when Malachar himself entered the fray, and Kaelith would have to face him alone. Vaul's echo hummed at his side, as if waiting, as if knowing. This was only the beginning. And before the sun set upon Safri, either Kaelith or Malachar would be dead. Chapter 25. The Sword and the Sorcery. The ruins of Vaul's forge. The battlefield was a land scarred by the past, a place where time itself had yet to heal the wounds of war. Vaul's forge, once a sacred place of creation, where the smith god had wrought weapons for the gods themselves, now lay in ruin, its colossal anvil shattered, its ancient forges long cold. The air still carried the faint scent of ash and burnt steel, and the stones were etched with cracks where divine hammers had once struck molten iron. And now it was to become a slaughterhouse once more. Kaelith Sunshadow stood with his warriors on the ridge overlooking the forge, the wind whipping through their cloaks, the glow of the dying sun casting them in shades of crimson and gold. Behind him, the shrouded form of Vaul's echo pulsed faintly beneath its wrappings, as if it knew where they had brought it. The blade was aware. It knew this place, and so did the Druchii. From the shattered valley below, the war horns of Naggaroth wailed like dying beasts. Dread Lord Malachar Blackthorn had come for them, and he had brought his full fury. The clash of war hosts. The Druchii army surged forward, their formations moving like a dark tide, rolling across the broken remains of Vaul's forge. Corsairs leapt ahead, their barbed whips cracking, their curved blades gleaming in the dying light. They were the vanguard, swift and deadly, eager to draw first blood. Behind them marched the executioners of Harganeth, their massive great swords dragging along the ground, their blackened armor stained with the blood of 1,000 past victims. Further still, dark shards lined the ruined walls, their repeater crossbows already leveled, their fingers poised to unleash a storm of steel-tipped death. And behind them all, upon a black chariot wreathed in violet fire, stood Malachar himself. He raised his blade, his voice a command of thunder and death. "Leave none alive, the blade is mine." The Druchii charged. Kaelith gritted his teeth, then drew his sword, turning to his warriors. "For Yvresse, for Ulthuan." And the Asur met them head-on. The battle for Vaul's forge. The two forces collided with the force of an earthquake, steel meeting steel, screams ripping through the air as the battle descended into madness. Kaelith's blade sang as it cut through the first corsair, his riposte swift and brutal, severing the warrior's jugular, blood spurting across the stone. Aelric Starborn roared as he shouldered through the line, his greatsword swinging in wide arcs, disemboweling one Druchii, cleaving through another's ribcage, their corpses tumbling lifelessly onto the blood-soaked ground. The corsairs fought with savage speed, their whips lashing, their blades seeking weak points in Asur armor. One wrapped his whip around an Asur warrior's leg, yanking him off balance before plunging a dagger deep into his throat, twisting it cruelly. Another drove his scimitar into an Asur's stomach, then ripped it sideways, opening the elf's belly in a gruesome display of entrails and gore. Kaelith countered another strike, kicking a corsair's knee backward until it snapped, then ramming his blade through the enemy's ribs. The executioners entered the fray next, their greatswords cleaving through flesh and bone with terrifying ease. One of Kaelith's warriors, a noble named Vaelin, blocked a downward strike, but the executioner's blade carved straight through his sword, splitting it in two, then buried itself in his skull. His body crumpled before he even realized he was dead. Elric saw it and let out a furious bellow, meeting an executioner in single combat, their blades crashing together in a deadly contest of strength and skill. Sorcery unleashed. And then the sky turned black. Malachar had entered the battle. From the warped chariot, his hand rose, fingers wreathed in sorcery, his voice a whisper that cracked the heavens. "You have no gods here, Sunshadow." And with a thrust of his hand, the magic unleashed itself. The sky split open, and from the darkness, ethereal spears of shadow rained down, impaling Asur warriors where they stood, piercing through armor, flesh, and bone, nailing their bodies to the ruined stones below. One warrior screamed, his eyes boiling in their sockets before his body disintegrated into blackened ash. Another was bisected mid-run, his torso falling one way, his legs another, his last breath gurgling from his severed throat. Kaelith raised his own hand, countering with a pulse of golden magic, trying to shield his warriors. But Malachar was stronger. The impact sent Kaelith staggering back, the force of the magic nearly ripping his soul apart. He barely recovered before a shadowy blade slashed toward his neck. Kaelith ducked, barely evading the executioner's killing blow, countering with a precise thrust, straight through the enemy's throat, ripping it free in a spray of crimson. Aelric slammed his greatsword into another executioner's chest, twisting it before ripping through spine and muscle, sending the head and shoulders toppling from the corpse. But there were too many. The Druchii were pressing forward, forcing the Asur back. They were losing ground. And Kaelith knew if Malachar claimed Vaul's echo, all of this would be for nothing. The final stand at the anvil. Kaelith and Aelric retreated toward the great anvil, their backs against the last remnants of Vaul's forge. Vaul's echo shone brighter now, as if aware of its own fate approaching. Malachar dismounted from his chariot, stepping over the corpses of fallen warriors, his blackened blade dripping with sorceress ichor. He raised it toward Kaelith. "Give me the blade, Sunshadow, and I will make your death swift." Kaelith spat blood onto the ground. "Come and take it." Malachar smiled, his hand rising to cast another spell. But before he could, a piercing scream tore through the battlefield. Selithra Duskbane had returned. And this time, she was not here to serve Malachar. She was here to claim what was hers. The battle was far from over. It was about to reach its true climax. Chapter 26. The Last War. A battlefield of corpses. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of blood, the echoes of battle still ringing across the shattered remains of Vaul's forge. Kaelith Sunshadow's breath came ragged, his body aching from the clash with Malachar's warhost. Around him the bodies of Asur and Druchii alike lay scattered across the battlefield, their lifeblood seeping into the cracked and broken earth. Yet, even as the battle slowed, the war was not over, because at the heart of the carnage, still pulsing with unrestrained power, lay Vaul's echo. The blade hummed with its own hunger, its broken form pulsing, as if it could feel its own fate approaching. Kaelith gritted his teeth, his mind racing. There was no time left. If he did not find a way to bind its power, this war would never end. And then, as if in answer to his desperation, the runes beneath his feet flickered. The ruins of Vaul's forge were not entirely dead. There was still one final ward left intact. A way to end this once and for all. The truth buried in fire. Kaelith dropped to one knee, his fingers tracing the ancient runes etched into the blackened stone. They were faint, worn from centuries of battle, but the magic within them still flickered like embers in dying coals. He closed his eyes, reaching out with his mind, not as a warrior, but as a scholar, as a student of Hoeth. The whisper of Vaul's voice drifted through the broken forge, not in words, but in memories. Fire, steel, creation, destruction. And then, the final truth. Vaul's echo was never meant to be wielded. It was not a weapon of war, nor was it a gift of the gods. It was a prison. The blade itself was a shard of the first Sundering, a fragment of the very rift that had torn Ulthuan and Naggaroth apart. And it could not be destroyed, but it could be sealed. Here, in the heart of the ruined forge, where it had first been bound by divine hands. Kaelith's eyes snapped open. He knew what had to be done, and it would likely kill him. The hunt begins anew. The moment Kaelith rose, he knew he was no longer alone. Across the battlefield, Selithra Duskbane emerged from the shadows, her body battered, her once elegant armor cracked and stained with blood. Her violet eyes locked onto the artifact, burning with obsession and madness. "No more delays, Sunshadow," she rasped, stepping forward. "Give it to me." Kaelith lifted the blade, feeling the weight of destiny pressing upon him. "You don't even understand what it is," he said. Selithra smiled, though it was a brittle, fractured thing. "I understand more than you ever will." She lashed out, a whip of shadow magic cutting through the air, aiming for Kaelith's throat. Aelric intercepted, his greatsword slamming into her magic mid-strike, dispelling the attack with a burst of golden light. "Not this time, witch!" Aelric snarled, his armor still slick with Druchii blood. Selithra hissed, but before she could strike again, a new force entered the battle. Dreadlord Malachar Blackthorn had recovered, and he was furious. Enough of this. The ground shook beneath his command, his presence like a storm given form, his enchanted blade wreathed in obsidian flames. Selithra turned, her eyes narrowing. "So," she mused, "you finally decide to do something yourself?" Malachar did not answer. He raised his hand, and the sky split open. The Druchii's wrath. From the heavens, bolts of corrupted lightning crashed down, obliterating what remained of the ancient forge. Aelric rolled aside, barely dodging a column of dark fire that turned the ground into a molten ruin. Kaelith threw up a warding spell, shielding himself as another shockwave of raw energy sent warriors tumbling like dolls. Malachar stepped forward, his black armor gleaming in the dying light, his red eyes fixed on one thing alone: the artifact. "The blade belongs to me, Sunshadow," he said. "You cannot protect it. You cannot wield it. You are nothing but a broken Asur with delusions of duty." Kaelith tightened his grip on Vaul's echo, his breath slow and steady. "Then come and take it." Malachar smirked. And then the final battle began. A duel of legends. Malachar moved with impossible speed, his cursed blade slicing through the air like a comet of black fire. Kaelith met his strike, his own sword clashing against the corrupted steel, the impact shattering the stones beneath them. The force of the blow sent Kaelith skidding backward, his arm numb from the impact. Malachar pressed the attack, his strikes relentless, each blow filled with decades of battle-hardened cruelty. Kaelith dodged left, barely evading a downward slash that split the earth in two. Aelric moved to intervene, his greatsword swinging from Malachar's side. But the Dreadlord merely twisted, catching the blade with his gauntlet, then ripping Aelric's weapon from his grasp before sending a brutal knee into his ribs. Aelric crashed into a broken pillar, coughing blood, but still clawed his way to his feet. Kaelith did not hesitate. He lunged, his sword aiming for Malachar's throat. But the Dreadlord was faster. He caught Kaelith's wrist, twisting it painfully, forcing the Asur to his knees. "You are a fool," Malachar hissed. "You could have joined me. Now you die in the dirt, like all your kin." Kaelith grimaced, feeling his strength slipping. And then, Vaul's echo screamed. The blade unleashed a shockwave of raw, divine energy, breaking Malachar's grip, sending him reeling backward. Kaelith pushed forward, his sword flashing, and he drove it straight through Malachar's chest. The Dreadlord staggered, his eyes wide in shock, before Kaelith ripped the blade free, a burst of light consuming his enemy. Malachar collapsed, his body convulsing, his essence unraveling as the magic of the blade devoured him. And then he was gone. The last ward. The battle was over. Kaelith turned to the ruined forge, to the last flickering runes still etched into the ground. He knew what had to be done. Lifting Vaul's echo, he stepped into the circle of power, the runes flaring to life, and as the last ward ignited, the world was consumed in light. Chapter 27. The Final Duel. The Ruins of the Forge. The Forge of Vaul was burning, not with fire, nor with the glow of molten metal, but with the raw energy of Vaul's echo, surging through the shattered remnants of ancient stone and forgotten power. The runes upon the ground glowed with a sickly, pulsating light, fighting to contain the chaos that had been unleashed upon the world. Kaelith Sunshadow stood atop the crumbling anvil, his breath ragged, his body trembling from exhaustion. His armor was shattered, his wounds bled freely, but he had endured. Malachar was gone, his body consumed by the blade's fury. The Druchii warhost lay in ruins, scattered, broken. The surviving Asur warriors had fallen back, knowing that this fight was no longer theirs to win. It was between two people now, two warriors, two visions of the world. Kaelith turned, sword in hand, as Selithra Duskbane rose from the smoke and ruin, her daggers glinting in the firelight, her eyes burning with hatred and obsession. She was bleeding, broken, her once elegant armor dented and smeared with gore. But she was not defeated. Not yet. Her breath came slowly, her fingers curling around the hilts of her twin daggers, her body tensed like a serpent waiting to strike. She spoke, her voice low and venomous. "This ends here, Sunshadow." Kaelith raised his sword. "Yes, it does." Then they charged, blade against blade. Their weapons clashed in a storm of steel, the sound ringing across the ruined forge like a death knell. Kaelith swung first, his sword aiming for Selithra's ribs, but she twisted away, moving with inhuman speed, her daggers flashing in the firelight. She struck low, a feint, a trap, but Kaelith saw through it, pivoting just as her dagger sliced through the air where his throat had been. He countered, driving his elbow into her ribs, feeling the satisfying crunch of breaking bone. Selithra hissed in pain, but did not falter. She spun, one dagger arcing toward his face, the other seeking his heart. Kaelith barely dodged the first strike, the second slamming into his side, tearing through his armor, ripping into flesh. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, driving his knee into Selithra's stomach, forcing her backward. She staggered, coughing blood, but her smile did not waver. "Still too slow, Kaelith," she whispered. Kaelith exhaled sharply, stepping forward again. They circled each other like predators, their eyes locked, their bodies ready to strike at any moment. This was not just a duel between warriors. This was the Sundering itself, the hatred of their peoples made manifest in blood and steel. One way or another, it would end tonight. A war of flesh and will. Kaelith lunged, his sword a silver arc in the air, slicing toward Selithra's shoulder. She dropped low, her daggers slicing through his thigh, cutting deep, tearing through muscle and sinew. Kaelith let out a sharp grunt, but his counterattack was relentless. He slammed the hilt of his sword into Selithra's jaw, sending her reeling. She spat blood, but retaliated instantly, her blades dancing with wicked precision, one dagger scraping along his ribs, the other cutting across his forearm. Kaelith staggered, barely managing to deflect her next attack, their weapons locking in a clash of steel and will. Their faces were inches apart, breathing ragged, bodies slick with blood. Selithra grinned, even through the pain. "You should have let me have it, Kaelith." Kaelith pushed back, forcing her away, his sword rising again. "I would rather die." She wiped blood from her lips. "Then let's see if I can grant your wish." The edge of the abyss. The battle raged across the ruined forge, both warriors fighting with every ounce of strength they had left. Selithra was fast, unpredictable, her movements fluid and merciless, her daggers always aiming for the kill. Kaelith was relentless, unwavering, his sword moving like a storm of silver steel, blocking, countering, striking with precise, lethal intent. Blades met flesh. Blood sprayed against the blackened stone. Neither gave an inch. Kaelith saw an opening. Selithra overextended, her dagger missing by the width of a hair, and Kaelith drove his sword through her chest. The blade punched through her ribs, piercing clean through her back, a spray of crimson mist misting the air. Selithra gasped, her body jerking violently, her daggers slipping from her fingers. For a moment there was silence. Then Kaelith whispered, "It's over." Selithra's breath came in ragged gasps, her violet eyes wide with shock, with defiance, with something unspoken. She clawed at his armor, trying to hold herself up, refusing to fall. "No," she rasped. "Not like this." Kaelith twisted the blade. Selithra's body shuddered, her breath catching. Then at last, she collapsed to her knees. She lifted her gaze to him one last time, her smile faint, bitter, full of unspoken words. "You should have been born, Druchii Kaelith." Then her body fell still. The war between them was over. But the battle for the artifact was not yet done. The final choice. Kaelith stood over Selithra's lifeless body, his sword dripping with blood, his heart heavy with exhaustion and sorrow. He turned toward Vaul's echo, still pulsing upon the ruined anvil, still waiting. The blade had taken everything from him. His home, his people, his enemies. But now, here in the dying embers of Vaul's forge, he knew the truth. He could not keep it. He could not destroy it. He could only end its story, once and for all. Kaelith took a shaking breath, lifted the blade, and prepared to do what no one else had ever dared. He would return it to the fire, to end the Sundering's echo forever. The war was over. Now came the final fate of the blade itself. Chapter 28. A blade forged anew. The dying light of Vaul's forge. Kaelith Sunshadow stood before the shattered anvil of Vaul, the weight of history pressing down upon him. The air was thick with ash and sorcery, the battlefield around him a ruin of blood and bodies, the echoes of the past still lingering like ghosts in the smoke. Behind him, the corpse of Selithra Duskbane lay still, her lifeless violet eyes staring into the abyss, her fingers curled as if still reaching for the artifact that had destroyed her. And before him, Vaul's echo pulsed, its sundered form shifting between solid steel and something far more unnatural, warping the very fabric of reality around it. The blade was not at rest. It had never been meant to rest, and Kaelith knew, without doubt, that if he did nothing it would rise again. Another war would begin, another tragedy would be written in blood and fire. He could not let that happen, and so he did the unthinkable. He would reforge the blade, but not as it was before, not as a weapon of division and destruction, but as something new, something whole. The ritual begins. The runes of Vaul's forge were faint and ancient, but they were not yet dead. Kaelith moved with purpose, dragging the blade onto the remains of the anvil, placing its sundered pieces upon the cold, blackened stone. The moment it touched the surface, the entire forge trembled, a surge of ancient energy roaring to life. The runes beneath his feet ignited, golden lines of magic carving themselves into the air, forming a circle of binding around the forge. Elric Starborn, still wounded from battle, stumbled toward him, his face etched with disbelief. "Kaelith, what in the name of the gods are you doing?" Kaelith exhaled, his voice steady, certain. "Ending this." Aelith's gaze flickered toward the blade, still pulsing with unstable energy, then back to Kaelith. He clenched his fists. "Then I hope to every damned god in Ulthuan that you know what you're doing." Kaelith didn't answer, because the truth was, but he had to try, and so he began to chant the words of the old tongue, the same incantations that Vaul had once whispered to bind the first weapons of the gods. The runes flared brighter, the very air crackling with raw magic, the anvil beneath the blade glowing like the heart of a dying star. The forging had begun. Selithra's defiance. Kaelith had thought it was over. He had thought she was dead. But as the blade began to change, as the old magic began to bind its power anew, a whisper echoed across the forge. A voice. Her voice. "You think you can take this from me?" Kaelith's eyes snapped open. Selithra's body was still there, but her soul was not. A shadow peeled away from her corpse, rising into the air, a form of smoke and raw, unnatural magic, her face twisted with rage and desperation. "I will not be erased, Sunshadow." The forge howled, the magic resisting her, but she clawed at it, her essence wrapping around the blade, trying to bind herself to it once more. Kaelith gritted his teeth. She was still trying to take it, still trying to become something more than she ever was. If she succeeded, if she merged with the blade now, she would be something far worse than Druchii, worse than mortal. She would become a spirit of war itself, a being of endless conflict, unable to be killed, bound forever to the weapon that had started the Sundering. Kaelith would not allow that to happen. He tightened his grip on the reforging hammer, his voice rising over her screams. "You will not have this, Selithra. You never deserved it." And with a final, shattering strike, he brought the hammer down. The impact exploded with divine fury, a shockwave of light and fire blasting through the ruins, the forge erupting in raw magic as Selithra's essence was torn from the blade, ripped apart by the force. She screamed in agony, her spectral form shattering, unraveling, her soul ripped asunder. For the briefest moment, Kaelith saw her eyes widen, not with rage, but with something else. Realization. She had lost. Then she was gone, erased. Her connection to the blade was severed forever. And as the final runes flared, the blade upon the anvil was no longer Vaul's echo. It was something else entirely. The birth of the new blade. Kaelith lifted the newly forged weapon, feeling its weight, its balance, its purpose. It was no longer a shard of a rift, no longer a blade that had sundered empires and torn civilizations apart. It had been made whole once more. The energy that had once fought to break reality itself was now contained, woven into the very steel, reforged in the last fires of Vaul's forge. This was no longer a weapon of war. It was a ward against it. Aelric, stepping forward, looked at the blade with awe and exhaustion. "Does it still bear the same power?" he asked. Kaelith turned the blade over in his hand, watching as the light of the forge glowed softly in its edge, no longer screaming, no longer hungry for ruin. He exhaled slowly. "No, it bears something different now." Aelric looked at him, then to where Selithra had once stood. "Then it's finally over." Kaelith looked out over the ruins of the forge, over the battlefield littered with the dead, over the lands still scarred by centuries of war. He shook his head. Not yet, because the Druchii still remained, and they would not stop until they had what they wanted. But for the first time, Kaelith was no longer afraid. The blade had been forged anew, and this time it would be wielded by hands that would shape the future, not destroy it. With the weapon in hand, he turned toward the distant horizon, toward the battle yet to come. The final act was upon them. The war was not over, but Kaelith would end it, one way or another. Chapter 29. The Echo Fades. The rifts collapse. The sky cracked open. For centuries, Vaul's echo had existed as a scar upon the world, an artifact that was never truly a weapon but a wound, a fragment of the first Sundering, a piece of the rift that tore Ulthuan apart. Now it was whole once more, and the magic that had once fed upon its brokenness, that had kept the rift open, could no longer be sustained. The effect was instantaneous. A deep, horrifying groan rippled across the battlefield, the very air trembling as the energy holding the rift together collapsed. The sky darkened, swirling with crimson and violet storms, spirals of raw power breaking apart, their unnatural light flickering like dying stars. And then the world imploded inward. The fabric of reality twisted, the magic that had once been a howling void of energy now devouring itself, shrinking, closing, sealing. A roar of wind and power rushed outwards, sweeping across the ruins of Vaul's forge, throwing warriors off their feet, sending debris flying in every direction. Kaelith Sunshadow staggered, gripping his newly reforged blade, watching as the rift that had been the heart of this war for centuries finally died. The Sundering's echo had faded, and with it, so too did the madness that had consumed the battlefield. But the war was not over yet, not while Malachar still lived. Malkar's fury. The Dreadlord of Naggaroth stood upon the blood-stained hill, his black armor wreathed in sorcery, his red eyes burning with fury as he watched the rift collapse. This was not how it was meant to be. The power he had sought for centuries, the key to Ulthuan's destruction, the ruin of the Phoenix throne, was gone. The very thing he had built his war around had slipped through his fingers like sand, and the one responsible still breathed. Malakar's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword, his gaze locking on to Kaelith Sunshadow. The Asur stood defiant, his new blade glowing with the faintest trace of divine light, his face bloodied, his body battle-worn, but his will unbroken. A deep, seething rage burned through Malakar's veins. This whelp of a mage had not only defied him, he had robbed him of destiny itself. And for that, he would die screaming. "Kill them all!" Malakar snarled, his voice carrying like a storm over the battlefield. The Druchii warriors, still reeling from the collapse of the rift, snapped to attention, their weapons rising once more. The war was not finished. They would claim victory in blood, if not in magic. The battle turns. The Druchii charged, their blades glinting with the last dying light of the storm, their cries of hatred and desperation echoing across the ruins. But something had changed. With the rift gone, with Vaul's echo no longer feeding the war, the Druchii felt it. A shift in the air, a sudden absence of power. The curse of the blade had been lifted, and with it the madness that had driven them forward with unnatural fury. For the first time, fear crept into their ranks, and the Asurs saw it. Kaelith, despite his wounds, raised his sword high, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They have lost their prize. They have lost their purpose. Drive them back." Aelric Starborn, standing beside him, let out a defiant roar, his greatsword swinging in a deadly arc, cutting down a charging corsair in one brutal stroke. The Asur, seeing their enemies falter, rallied, pushing back against the tide of dark elves with renewed fury and purpose. The battlefield erupted once more, but this time the balance had shifted. For every blade raised in vengeance, a Druchii fell beneath its weight. For every strike of shadow and malice, the Asur answered with steel and fire. The tide was turning, and Malakar knew it. The order to retreat. The Dreadlord watched in silent rage as his forces buckled, the Asur warriors pushing them back, their formations breaking, their will collapsing like a crumbling fortress. The Druchii were proud, they were ruthless, but they were not fools. Without the artifact, without the rift's power, they had nothing left to fight for. Malakar's fingers curled into fists, his blade trembling at his side. This was not how it was supposed to end. He had waited centuries for this moment, and now it was slipping through his hands like dust. A corsair captain rushed to his side, his armor slick with blood. "My lord, we are being overrun." Malakar turned his burning gaze toward the battlefield. He could stay. He could die here, taking as many of these Asur wretches with him as he could. He could survive, retreat to fight another day. The words tasted like poison on his tongue, but he knew. The war was lost. For now. Malakar's eyes narrowed, his voice a low snarl. "Sound the retreat." The corsair hesitated, shocked by the order. Malakar's gaze snapped toward him, his voice a blade of ice and fury. Now, a moment later, the Druchii war horns blared, their haunting wails echoing across the battlefield, signaling what no warrior of Naggaroth wished to hear. Retreats. The Druchii began to pull back, some in controlled formations, others in desperate sprints, the once unbreakable war host scattering into the mist, their ships waiting upon the coast. The battle was over. Ulthuan had held, but Malakar's red gaze burned with promise as he turned his chariot away. This war was not finished, only delayed. Victory in ashes. Kaelith watched as the Druchii fled, his breath heavy, his wounds burning. The battlefield was silent now, the echoes of war fading into the wind. He lowered his sword. Aelric stepped beside him, watching the retreating war host with grim satisfaction. "We did it," he murmured. "We actually did it." Kaelith exhaled, his eyes lingering on the horizon, where the last of the Druchii warships vanished into the fog. "For now," he muttered. Aelric looked at him. "You think they'll come back?" Kaelith's grip tightened around the new blade at his side. "Always. For the war between Asur and Druchii would never truly end." But today at least, the Sundering's echo had finally faded. And that, for now, was enough. Chapter 30. The Eternal Struggle. The road back to Lothern. The wind howled through the ravaged peaks of Sapphire, carrying the last echoes of war through the ancient land. Kaelith Sunshadow rode in silence, his hands tight upon the reins, his cloak billowing behind him. The weight of Vaul's echo, reforged and contained, rested at his side. The journey had been long, the battle had been won, but the war had not ended. Aelric Starborn rode beside him, his wounds still bandaged, his armor still stained with blood that was not his own. He glanced at Kaelith, his voice cautious yet firm. "You have barely spoken since we left the ruins." Kaelith did not look at him, because there is nothing left to say. Aelric exhaled, shaking his head. "You still think this isn't over, don't you?" Kaelith finally turned, his gaze hard, weary, knowing. "It will never be over, Aelric." The words settled between them like a blade driven into stone, because Kaelith knew the truth. The war between Asur and Druchii would never truly end. There would always be another dreadlord, another war host, another mad sorceress seeking power. The cycle would repeat, and Vaul's echo, reforged or not, would haunt them forever. The home that no longer felt like home. Lothern was still as magnificent as ever. The towering spires of silver and sapphire, the great harbor teeming with proud elven ships, the golden glow of the Phoenix King's palace shining beneath the setting sun. It was a city untouched by war, a place that still clung to the illusion of peace. But to Kaelith, it felt hollow. As he and Aelric passed through the gates, elven nobles and scholars turned their heads, whispering as they saw the two warriors return, battered and bloodied, but victorious. Victory. The word tasted like ash in Kaelith's mouth. For what had been won? The Druchii had been driven back, but they were not defeated. And the cost had been far too great. The memories of the battle haunted him, the faces of the fallen lingering in his mind. Selithra's last words still echoed in his skull. "You should have been born Druchii, Kaelith." Perhaps she had meant it as an insult. Perhaps it had been a truth he did not want to face. The Phoenix Court's judgment. The halls of the Phoenix Court were as grand as they were cold. Kaelith stood before the assembled nobles and advisors, his newly reforged blade resting upon the stone floor. The Phoenix King himself had not deigned to attend, but his emissaries, robed in golden silk and adorned with symbols of authority, looked down at Kaelith with measured expressions. Loremaster Elithar stood at the forefront, his aged eyes weighing Kaelith with something that resembled both pride and regret. "You have done a great service to Ulthuan," he said. "You have sealed a wound that has bled for centuries." Kaelith's voice was quiet but sharp as honed steel. "I have delayed the inevitable." Murmurs swept through the council, but Elithar nodded gravely. "The Druchii will return," Kaelith continued, "and when they do, they will not seek an artifact to claim power. They will come for vengeance." A noble scoffed. "The Phoenix Guard will hold our borders, as they always have." Kaelith's gaze hardened. "Until they don't." The silence that followed was heavy. They did not want to hear the truth. The illusion of safety was too comforting. But Kaelith knew better. He had seen the eyes of the Druchii as they fled. He had heard Malakar's snarl of fury before his retreat. They were not defeated. They were waiting. The price of war. As the council adjourned, Kaelith stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the city, the sea stretching beyond the harbor like an endless abyss. Elric joined him, leaning on the railing, watching the waves. So what now? Kaelith closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the blade at his side, feeling the echoes of the past still whispering at the edges of his mind. I don't know, he admitted. Elric gave a wry chuckle. That's a first. Kaelith smirked, though there was no joy in it. Elric sighed, his expression turning serious. You could stay. The war host is broken. We have time to rebuild. Kaelith shook his head. You don't rebuild when you know another storm is coming. Elric studied him for a moment before understanding dawned. You're leaving. Kaelith didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the horizon, where the dark waters stretched beyond Ulthuan's shores. Someone has to watch, he murmured. Someone has to make sure it never happens again. Ulrich sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You're a damn fool, you know that? Kaelith turned, a faint, tired smirk on his lips. I've heard that before. Aelric shook his head. Then at least let me come with you. Kaelith hesitated, but in the end he nodded. Because he knew. He could not do this alone. A new path, an old war. Kaelith Sunshadow had saved Ulthuan. But in doing so he had learned a truth that few would dare to accept. The war would never truly end. The Druchii would return. The hatred that had split their people would never fade. The Sundering was not just an event in history. It was an eternal wound, an endless war that would never truly be won. But as Kaelith and Aelric rode toward the distant shores, toward whatever battles still lay ahead, he did not fear the future, because he would be there to face it. And perhaps one day when all the swords were broken and all the blood had dried, the echoes of the past would finally fall silent. But until then, the struggle would continue, as it always had, as it always would.